You're a new SCP Foundation researcher on tour of Site-17, familiarizing yourself with the location and its many anomalous inhabitants. It's the second largest Foundation containment site out there, and it's also the kind of job that most junior researchers dream of. Low-risk humanoid containment, baby. Most of the inhabitants in your sector are cordial, willing to comply with orders from staff, and seem, for all intents and purposes, pretty much human. You pass from door to door, looking through the viewing hatch of each one. You can't believe what you're seeing. It's a wonderful who's who of anomalous humanoids. You see the wise, bearded face of SCP-343, known to some as God. You see the blue eyes and shining blonde hair of Iris, SCP-105 looking wistfully into a Polaroid picture. You see the tanned, melancholic face of Kane, SCP-073, as he stares off into the middle distance. Face after face after face passes. You can see yourself getting more familiar with each one. Yes, your time here will be… Wait, was that Hitler? You stop and walk back to the door you just passed, where you can't help but stop and stare in disbelief. Yes, it's him. It's gotta be him. You recognize the unpleasant sneer, the hideous comb-over, the silly little toothbrush mustache. The SCP Foundation seems to have Adolf Hitler, the former leader of the Third Reich in World War II, in active containment, and his designation is SCP-2430. You've seen killer toasters and masks that can take over people's minds, but you've never seen anything as surreal as this. You immediately run to your superior and ask how and why Hitler is in one of the Site-17 humanoid containment cells. Buckle in, because we can guarantee it's one of the most insane stories you've ever heard. It's late April, 1945, and the Soviets are rampaging through Nazi Germany, destroying everything in their path. The German forces have been nearly obliterated, and Hitler and the rest of his Reich Chancellery have retreated to a secure bunker beneath Berlin. There on April 30th, 10 days after his 56th birthday, Hitler died. This was truly unfortunate for the Soviets, as they wished to have had the chance to kill him themselves. 2 days later, Soviet forces stormed the Führer bunker. It was little more than a formality at that point, as the news of Hitler's death had already gone public. By the time they arrived, all that was left of Hitler was a pile of mostly burned remains. A fitting end for someone who had caused the same cruel fate for so many others. They collected what was left of Hitler's body and brought it back to the fatherland, a kind of trophy for their nation. But Hitler dying before Joseph Stalin could get his hands on him was not what Stalin wanted. Hitler had not only caused the deaths of millions of Russians, he had personally betrayed Stalin's trust. And when you betray Stalin, bad things happen to you. Very, very bad things. 2 years earlier, in 1943, Soviet forces had raided a camp in Genowiska, belonging to the Obscura Corps. Think of them as the Nazis' own version of the SCP Foundation, who were hell-bent on gathering anomalous people and artifacts to increase the power of the Third Reich. They were a far more militant offshoot of the Thule Society, a group that described itself as a study group for Germanic antiquity. While this may seem innocent, the Thule Society was actually a racist cult, closely aligned with the goals and ideas of the German Nazi Party. Many have also speculated that they were heavily involved in the occult, and it's this mysticism-obsessed offshoot that went on to form the Obscura Corps. And in their Genowiska base, they'd obtained 100 pieces of enchanted occult flesh with human skeletons embedded in each of them. This flesh was believed to originate from the mythological Sarimnir, the beast hunted and eaten again and again by the pantheon of Norse gods, having the qualities of both a wild boar and a goat. The flesh can bond to skeletons and give them a quality somewhat like immortality. Any flesh cut from them will regrow time and time again if given a rest period. Now that he had both the flesh of Sarimnir and Hitler's burnt remains, Stalin had an idea. A perfect way to not only bring satisfaction to the Russian people and the world, but to finally exact the true revenge that Hitler had denied to him. He called it Project Judica, namely after the very bottom level of hell reserved for betrayers like Judas. a perfect tribute for an old ally turned enemy. He couldn't kill Hitler before, but if Stalin was going to get the chance, Hitler needed to live again. For years, Stalin's top scientists tried to use arcane methods to resurrect Hitler by combining his remains with the flesh of Suramir. At times, they even came close to creating a new Hitler, but there was one huge issue. The creature they created could not feel pain, and for Stalin's plans of violent and painful retribution, the lack of suffering simply would not do. They destroyed what they had created and went back to the drawing board. Stalin would stop at nothing to get what he wanted, even if it meant breaking every law of nature in the process. In order to make his twisted dream a reality, Stalin formed an unholy alliance with a group known as the Uralic Fleshcrafters, a neo-Sarkic cult that was a branch of the nightmarish religion of Sarkicism. This group essentially worships avatars of flesh, corruption, and disease, and are behind some of the most terrifying and disgusting anomalies out there, including the flesh that hates and the bone orchard. True Sarkicists, who show the proper devotion to their vile deities and know the right rituals to contact them, are often granted anomalous powers that spread the Sarkic influence further across the known dimensions. These powers will usually involve having a supernatural ability to manipulate the flesh of themselves and others, allowing them to enhance their bodies, cheat death, and warp their enemies beyond repair. They can sometimes even create life, if they're a powerful enough acolyte of Sarkicism. And it was because of these powers that Stalin wanted the Uralic Fleshcrafters under his command. In exchange for their participation, he would give them a vast quantity of the flesh of Suramir, which they could use for their own sinister Sarkic purposes. A deal was struck, and the true work of resurrecting Hitler began. Stalin was very specific in his requirements. He gave the Uralic Fleshcrafters extra bones to compensate for what had gone missing from Hitler's burnt remains. He also gave them samples of the flesh of Suramir to achieve the desired effects of a near-immortal tolerance for damage. However, Stalin demanded that he heighten this new Hitler's capacity to experience pain, so that every suffering inflicted on him would be 3 times worse than anyone else. And true to their word, the Fleshcrafters got to work and began creating just such a creature. By now it was the early 1950s, and Stalin was putting the pieces in place for his grand revenge. Once the new Hitler was finished, he would hold a new trial for him in the Russian courts, where he would preside over the sentencing personally. Once the new Hitler was done, the Uralic Fleshcrafters were rewarded for their participation in Project Judica, with 4,000 kilograms of the flesh of Suramir. Stalin now had his very own personal Hitler chew toy that he could maim and torture as much as he pleased, knowing that he would always heal and soon be ready for more. In their infinite generosity, the Fleshcrafters even taught Stalin a new method of torment for his old enemy, a process known as the Rite of Nyos. It's a torture that's been described by many as being like the Chinese Ling Chi, also known as the lingering death, or slow slicing, but it is probably best known as the death by 1,000 cuts. The Soviets and the Sarkics parted ways. For the next few years, Stalin took a great deal of pleasure in visiting Hitler's cage now and then to torture him, until Stalin himself eventually passed away from natural causes. The GRUP division, which is essentially the Soviet answer to the SCP Foundation, decided it would be best to do away with the immortal Hitler clone after Stalin's death. He no longer served any purpose, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't permanently kill him either. In the end, they settled on a kind of compromise. He would be buried alive and forgotten, forced to live a torturous eternity that he could never escape. Until, of course, he was dug up and rescued by none other than the members of Obscura, a modern splinter group of the original Obscura Corps. Like many high-profile Nazis who'd escaped the war, the new Hitler was spirited away to a safe house run by sympathizers in Argentina. The ones taking care of him received the following correspondence from the Obscura agents who'd first dug the new Hitler back up.
We have managed to rescue the Führer and bring him to safety, but he is effectively dead on the inside. I blame the Reds for their inhumane treatment of the Führer, who may have been bewitched by the Reds' Wunderwaffe. I wish we could mercy kill him, but we've tried everything. He just won't perish. Don't abandon him. He's too distinct in plain sight. They didn't have the new Hitler for long, though. In 1960, efforts to hunt down the remaining Nazi fugitives increased in intensity.
The new Hitler was soon captured by Mossad agents searching for Nazis in Buenos Aires, and then remanded to the containment of the SCP Foundation when they realized that he had a number of anomalous properties, such as his incredible regenerative abilities, as well as the fact that his DNA seems to be based on that of a wild boar and a goat rather than a human. However, X-rays conducted by the Foundation have discovered traces of cyanide still in his system, as well as traces of lead in his skull where the bone has regrown over the bullet. In other words, it was unquestionably the real Hitler, and he was now in Foundation custody forevermore. It's such a wild story even by Foundation standards that you can barely summon the words to respond once your supervisor is finished. He just stands there with a slight smile, basking in your amazement. Before you can even ask again, he confirms the facts one more time. Yes, it is the real Hitler. The only functional difference is that he can't die and he has a heightened sense of pain compared to most people. You think on what you've been told for just a moment, and then you have only one question. Are we allowed to punch him? Your supervisor smiles and says, "Of course, we all do." In a remote part of Russia, a mysterious disease outbreak was tearing through a tiny farming village with terrifying side effects. There was no cure, no clue to where it came from, and worst of all, the disease's terrifying impact didn't end with death. No, it was after those carrying the disease died that the real horrors started. After an agonizing fever that leaves the victims writhing in pain, they quickly succumb to the disease, only to rise from their graves to wreak havoc on the living. The virus continues to spread until the corpses outnumber those trying to hide from them, as the world spirals into almost certain ruin. It sounds like the plot of a zombie movie, but for the SCP Foundation, this is anything but fiction. And the terror that unfolded in that little Siberian town is the first recorded encounter with SCP-610, also known as the Flesh That Hates. First, livestock began to vanish from farms. Theft or wild animals were suspected, but no suspects could be found, and no mutilated remains turned up. The animals weren't being stolen, and they weren't being eaten, so what happened to them? With no more animals left to lose, the farmers themselves then began to disappear. But the authorities refused to take the missing persons cases seriously. The missing farmers' families would contact the police, make a report, and then the whole thing was forgotten. It was written off just as another unsolved disappearance, which wasn't uncommon in the wild and unforgiving region. Then, the police themselves began to disappear. The families of the missing farmers would sometimes report strange sounds from the surrounding woods, describing moans and inhuman screeches of pain. One young boy reported seeing a cow with what he described as tentacles lurking around the edge of the trees. Regional police were dispatched to the location and ordered to investigate and report back on their findings within 24 hours. But the units sent to the area didn't report back and were never heard from again. Upon learning of the reports, the Russian government grew increasingly concerned, fearing domestic insurgency or foreign espionage of some kind could be at play. They sent a small team of special agents to the area, and one by one, those agents disappeared, just like the others before them. It seemed no one who went into the village after the disappearances started ever came out again. They had all simply vanished. Desperate for answers, the Russian government contacted the only people in the world who could help: the SCP Foundation. What the Foundation found over the course of their investigation would shock and unnerve them, going beyond anything they had previously discovered. Before the investigation officially began, the affected area was sealed off by the Russian government. Not knowing if it would be safe to send researchers into the containment perimeter, the Foundation set up a small camera-mounted unit, nicknamed Herbie, to capture footage of whatever remained of the village. The images captured by Herbie revealed what exactly had become of the people in this doomed village, and the true nightmarish nature of SCP-610. SCP-610 is a Keter-class entity, meaning it's an anomaly that's exceedingly difficult to contain consistently or reliably, with containment procedures often being extensive and complex. 610 is a highly contagious skin disease that initially manifests like an ordinary allergic reaction, with symptoms including increased sensitivity, itching, and a rash. But within just 3 hours of those initial symptoms appearing, the rash starts to turn into masses of scar tissue on the chest and arms. These masses spread over the legs and back of the victim and completely consume them in thick, rubbery flesh within 5 hours. Once they're covered, the victim will cease all vital functions. Unfortunately for them, and doubly so for those around them, they do not stay dead. About 3 minutes after expiring, the victim's vitals will restart at a heightened rate, and the masses of flesh encasing their body will begin to move and multiply, mutating them into a form beyond anything resembling the human they once were. The specific type of mutation varies from case to case, but has included the head becoming massive and bulbous, the growth of extra limbs, and, in especially gruesome cases, the victim's body splitting apart to allow extra tendrils of flesh to sprout from the open wound. Occasionally, an infected person will stop moving and become rooted to the ground in a set location. Once it is settled, their flesh will spread itself across the ground, encasing all nearby objects in flaps of scar tissue. The infected that maintain their mobility are highly aggressive, even violent, and will attempt to infect any living thing that comes into their line of sight. The disease does not only infect humans, and can take over any living organism within a matter of hours. Due to the highly contagious and dangerous nature of the disease, safe observation of infected specimens and areas is only possible with drones and mounted cameras. This brings us back to Herbie, the first such mounted camera to record footage of the infected area. Herbie was deployed to an infection site, also known as Site A, without any damage. It remained at the outside perimeter of the village for 2 hours, observing several infected humans and fire damage to many of the homes, before following an infected into an intact house. Herbie's camera feed captured the infected person entering the house and sitting down at the table inside. There were several other infected humans in the house, and one unidentified infected creature that remained immobile under the table. After viciously assaulting one of the other infected humans, the infected returned to the table and began to lay out plates on top of it. Pieces of its flesh began to wriggle and tear away from its body, before settling onto each plate. Once the plates were filled, the infected sitting at the table began to grab at the flesh and crush it into their mouths, in a perverse imitation of a normal mealtime gathering. After capturing this stomach-churning display, Herbie left the house and continued to explore the village. It recorded footage of a large stack of bodies that seemed to be made up of both Russian military and civilians, with an infected sitting on top. As Herbie maneuvered towards the remains of the town hall, an infected grabbed the rover off the ground. Herbie's camera was able to capture the face of the infected that grabbed the rover. The face was that of a young girl around 10 years old, strangely intact atop a large, distorted body. The final moments of Herbie's camera feed captured the infected girl's face bursting open, revealing tendrils of flesh that pulled Herbie into the gaping maw. Then, the feed cut to black. Herbie was regarded as lost, but the video feed briefly resumed 5 hours later, showing the camera covered with an unidentified slime. After this, the video feed was cut for good, and Herbie abandoned in Site A. The Foundation has sent several manned expeditions into Site A, where many expedition forces have fallen victim to the infected. Several operatives were also lost in an earthquake that revealed a network of underground tunnels. A manned expedition into these tunnels was attempted, and the video feed that was captured by the researchers on the expedition was deeply disturbing. There were images of an abandoned church filled with infected, and a mass of uninfected or partially infected human captives. The final moments of the video feed from this expedition captured several operatives being murdered by an infected human wielding a farming scythe, indicating that the infected are capable of using simple weaponry in addition to brute force. The use of this weapon, paired with the presence of captives in the underground tunnels, paints a terrifying picture of the kind of organization the infected are capable of. No more manned expeditions have been attempted, or if they have been highly classified. Ordinarily, once a new SCP is discovered, it is placed in containment at the Foundation, with special procedures in place so that it can be studied or even neutralized in the rare occasions where it's deemed necessary. When it comes to SCP-610 though, containment might just be impossible. It simply covers too much area and is too dangerous to expose to human researchers. Instead, all infected areas have been isolated with the permission of the Russian government. There is an official perimeter established around these areas, and any civilians that approach them are told to leave under the pretense of ongoing military operations. For once, a top-secret military project is the more innocent answer. Armed guards are placed at the perimeter of every infected area, and any living thing with symptoms of SCP-610 spotted near the perimeter is to be immobilized, killed, and burned from as far away as possible. Any living thing that comes in contact with SCP-610, whether a soldier, a scientist, or a civilian, is immediately terminated. and their remains destroyed. If someone comes within 3 meters of an infected organism, they will be quarantined and remotely examined to determine if they have been infected. While the spread of SCP-610 can be airborne, it has been determined to be far less contagious when spread through air particles as opposed to physical contact. The infection sites remain active to this day, like modern-day leper colonies, though they are isolated from the general population, and the military is doing everything in their power to contain the infected. SCP-610 is still very much alive. It is rare for an entity to exist that the Foundation cannot truly contain, but can only try to guard against, and that makes this infection all the more terrifying. Who knows how much it has mutated over the years, growing, spreading, hungry for new hosts. There is still so much that the Foundation does not know about the flesh that hates, such as how it works, what it can do, or even where it came from, since the origin of the first infection is still, at this point, entirely unknown. It has shown itself to be capable of learning, planning, and protecting itself, so who is to say that it couldn't figure out a way to escape from its isolated area? It is so highly contagious and spreads so quickly that just one tiny infected rabbit and one inattentive soldier could be enough for SCP-610 to reach the general population. If it did, its violent, destructive nature and hatred for all life would mean that everything, not just the people, but animals, plants, and the world itself, could be at risk. And no one is ready for this kind of infection. A disease that turns the human body against itself, turns our skin into a weapon and a tomb, stripping away identity, humanity, and everything that isn't made of the same hateful flesh. So let's hope that the perimeter holds. And the next time you feel a little itchy, try not to think about what might happen next.
It's been said that knowledge is power, and when it comes to SCP-2440, that might really be the case. Like many of the anomalies and entities that have been kept on file by the SCP Foundation, SCP-2440, the being known as the Sealed King, is a malicious creature of untold, devastating power. The key word there is untold, and we mean it in the most literal sense. You cannot know about SCP-2440. It must remain untold. Unless, of course, you have at least level 4 clearance. You do have the right level of clearance, don't you? We really would have to hate to break up the amnestics and wipe your memory at the end of this video. Assuming that you do have adequate clearance, then it is time to introduce you to SCP-2440, known to some as the Sealed King or Ziotla to its friends, if it had any friends, that is. If you are familiar with the likes of the infamous Hanged King or the even more infamous Scarlet King, then you will have heard the term Eldritch Being thrown around before. An Eldritch abomination is an almost godlike entity, one which does not adhere to the natural laws of the universe as we understand them. Their disturbing otherworldliness is almost indescribable to any mortal person. It is a description that can be easily used to define SCP-2440, along with the words Keter-class anomaly and existentially terrifying. The Sealed King is an extra-dimensional entity, a being that inhabits a plane of existence far outside the physical reality of our own universe. While the creature's physical appearance has yet to be observed by any in this dimension, some have depicted it as resembling a gigantic being with a mass of squid-like tentacles, along with a glowing humanoid form in its center. What makes SCP-2440 such a formidable threat, however, is not just the creature's immense size. One of SCP-2440's core abilities is the power to influence and manipulate the minds of mortal beings. But this isn't as simple as the Sealed King choosing one person from our universe and driving them like a remote-controlled car. SCP-2440's influence is spread mimetically. By manipulating data and information, SCP-2440 slips its mimetic agents into texts, images, even spoken phrases, and other audio stimuli. Think of it like subliminal messaging or product placement. Imagine for a moment that you see a character on a TV show eating a certain brand of black and white sandwich cookie, and that makes you decide that you want to go to the store and buy some delicious black and white sandwich cookies to enjoy for yourself. That idea was planted in your head by something you saw, and it had an influence on your behavior. SCP-2440 operates on a very similar principle, but with one key difference. Once enough people become aware of it,
SCP-2440 will use those to subtly spread its influence, controlling the actions of those it manages to infect, and its hold becomes stronger the further they spread the knowledge of the Sealed King. To put it plainly, the more people that become aware of the Sealed King's existence, the more powerful this eldritch abomination becomes. The range and scope of SCP-2440's abilities varies depending on the quantity of people its influence has been mimetically spread to. According to research by the SCP Foundation, if 200 people or less have been infected, then these individuals will demonstrate an increased interest in media belonging to the horror, science fiction, or fantasy genres, whether this be films, books, or images that fall into one of these categories. Exposure to these desired materials is believed to increase the spread of the Sealed King's influence. If the number of infected individuals climbs to between 201 and 500 people, then SCP-2440 has been known to take direct control of a single infected person. This control is somewhat limited though, with the Sealed King only able to maintain a connection with the controlled host for half an hour. During this time, the infected person will attempt to infect further people by creating works that contain subtle details about the nature of SCP-2440. Historically, when infection levels have reached this phase, Foundation researchers have been able to communicate with SCP-2440 through conversations with its host. The creature displays a very hostile attitude towards humanity, and it has been quite open with the fact that its sole purpose is to continue infecting individuals until it is able to manifest physically in our reality without the need for a host, something that feels like it's right out of the evil eldritch entity playbook. When infection of the knowledge spreads up to 1,500 people, SCP-2440 becomes able to take full control of another infected individual without the previous limitations. By making them fully subservient, it will then use this person to speak simultaneously to any and all that have been infected with information regarding the Sealed King. Next, if up to 10,000 people become infected, more of SCP-2440's abilities start to influence this dimension. The creature is known to be able to distort and reshape reality, though at this point SCP-2440 still needs to control a host. But even though its powers and abilities have increased, at this stage the creature shows no interest in actually using them, and its focus still remains on using its human host to spread its mimetic agents, furthering the infection. Once the number of people infected by SCP-2440 through subliminal mimetic information surpasses 10,000, the Sealed King is able to manifest its true form outside of a human host for a maximum time frame of 1 hour. This is the point of no return, as SCP-2440's reality-bending powers are dramatically increased. The methods that would have previously kept the creature at bay will cease to be effective, and it can take direct control of up to 1,000 of those it has infected. Normally, the SCP Foundation limits the number of people permitted to know about SCP-2440 to 100 cleared personnel. This is achieved through the use of amnestics. Given that SCP-2440 is a creature that grows stronger the more people know about it, these drugs certainly seem like a viable way of keeping that number nice and low. But once infection numbers reach 10,000, that's when amnestics are just no longer enough. Based on the information about the Sealed King that is available to them, SCP Foundation personnel have projected that if the number of people infected by SCP-2440 ever reached as high as 100,000 or more, the creature would likely be able to manifest outside a host for longer, possibly up to 2 hours. It is also believed that SCP-2440 would be capable of creating dimensional portals, either inviting anomalies from other universes into our own, or simply creating its own anomalous creatures. By this point, any and all infected individuals would be fully under the Sealed King's control. Finally, if 1 million people were to become infected, SCP-2440 would most likely achieve its ultimate goal. The eldritch creature would be able to fully and permanently manifest itself in our dimension, in its true form, most likely leading to an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. Fortunately, through the dispensing of amnestics, the SCP Foundation have managed to prevent such a scenario from coming to pass. Additionally, containment teams are regularly sent to investigate any reported awareness of SCP-2440, and any infected individuals are either treated with memory-altering drugs or simply terminated. The entity has been known to spread its influence through text too, though, and even the documents within the SCP Foundation's archives aren't safe. The Foundation attempts to keep any links to the Sealed King within other SCP files hidden to avoid a spread of knowledge about this extra-dimensional eldritch abomination. However, while only 100 members of authorized SCP personnel are aware of SCP-2440, the Foundation isn't the only organization aware of this being's existence. A group calling themselves the Children of God is comprised of individuals previously infected with the knowledge of SCP-2440's existence, and has supposedly been around even longer than the Foundation has. These people worship the Sealed King as a deity, and seek to infect others with the same information that the creature uses to influence them. Carrying out the whims of this extra-dimensional threat, the Children of God attempt to spread the word, as it were, by any and all means available to them. The Foundation considers any member of the Children of God to be highly dangerous, and containment teams are advised to either capture them on site or use lethal force to terminate them. The Children of God were previously based in a compound somewhere in the United States, and during an assault on their base, the Foundation was able to recover documents that describe the possible origin of SCP-2440. According to these documents, at the very dawn of time, old gods emerged from the empty abyss of nothingness, otherwise referred to as Mother Void. This entity granted life across the universe, all other realities, and every conceivable dimension. However, the story detailed in the Children of God's legend claims that the old gods were fickle, twisted, and brutal things, with no purity in them. It seems to suggest that the old gods were similar entities to SCP-2440, capable of bending and reshaping reality, and apparently did so purely for their own amusement within the newly created universe. These old gods created creatures in their own image, toying with the fabric of reality like children with blocks, building and destroying at will. Before long, the old gods began to turn on each other, focusing their natural jealousy on their siblings that had been born of the Void. The firstborn of the Void and Chaos, a being called Metal, coveted the creations of his fellow old gods, and flooded the newly created worlds with a rampaging army of vile, grotesque beasts he had made. As Metal attempted to kill his various siblings, the other old gods retaliated and sent the universe into a period of darkness where the blood of young life flowed like water. However, none of the old gods could ever die, only be forgotten. But they had created so many creatures to serve them and fulfill their purposes that it seemed impossible that this would ever happen. The Children of God's documents then describe Xiotla, or SCP-2440 as he is otherwise known. Apparently the firstborn of Mother Void and an entity called Father Light, SCP-2440 is also referred to by many reverent titles such as Lord of the Gods, Devourer of the Impure, and Savior of Life. Being both born of light and darkness of the Void, Xiotla was considered to be a true god, and according to the creature's followers, did not set about creating life but perfecting it. The old gods turned on Xiotla, his half-siblings attacking him with the armies and monstrosities they had created. However, some of these creatures turned on their masters in service of SCP-2440 instead. After generations of warfare between SCP-2440 and the old gods, Xiotla finally vanquished Matol in single combat that lasted 10,000 years and laid waste to countless worlds, almost tearing the universe apart. Eventually prevailing, Xiotla cast his siblings down into oblivion. But as he did so, Matol cursed him, banishing SCP-2440 from the universe, implied in these documents to have been our very own reality. The Children of God venerate the creature as their Lord and Savior, with more of their documents claiming that this king of all mankind is wrongfully sealed away. They believe their sealed king is returning, destined to reappear in this dimension and lay waste to our reality. Whether this is truly the origin of SCP-2440, or just what the entity wishes its infected disciples to believe, is unclear. Whatever the case, we suggest you quickly forget everything you know about SCP-2440 for your own safety.
There is a dangerous creature that could be anywhere in the world, hiding in plain sight, casually walking through crowded streets filled with people. A monster that is nearly impossible to see, blending into its surroundings almost perfectly. Not invisible, but unnoticeable, almost completely undetectable. But then you spot a familiar outfit in a crowd. You now know where the creature is, but it goes both ways, since the moment you find it, it knows where you are. There is now not a single place on the earth that you could hide where it wouldn't find you, and it won't ever stop looking. To the staff at the Foundation, this creature is known as SCP-4885, but you and I know him by a different name. You may have seen his face hundreds of times, or stared for hours at a page trying to catch a glimpse of him. To us, he's Waldo. While this might feel like a very long-winded and silly joke, maybe even a prank that has been inserted into the SCP archives, it is anything but. If you grew up any time after the late 1980s, then you will likely be familiar with the Where's Waldo books. But for the uninitiated, there are a series of puzzle books created by illustrator Martin Hanford. Each book in the Where's Waldo line contains multiple double-page spreads of colorful, crowded scenes. The goal is for readers to spot the ever-elusive titular character, Waldo, who is hidden among the mass of other characters. Waldo himself is easily recognized, thanks to a design that has become truly iconic over the years. He is always depicted as wearing a red and white striped shirt, with a bobble hat in matching colors. Waldo also sports jeans, circular rimmed glasses, and sometimes a wooden walking stick. So with that important context out of the way up front, what exactly is SCP-4885? Is the character from these children's books somehow brought to life? Has the character of Waldo always been a malicious, malevolent entity too powerful to be contained within his own books? Well, not exactly. SCP-4885 only seems to resemble the famous children's book character. Whether or not he is the living manifestation of Waldo in the real world is both unclear and up for debate. Examining its outward appearance, SCP-4885 does share the humanoid shape and looks to be wearing the same recognizable clothing of Waldo. There are, however, two notable bodily dissimilarities between the Waldo on the page and the physical form of SCP-4885. For one, this Waldo appears to be much paler to the one found in the book series. More noticeably, however, is the fact, despite wearing the same circular glasses, SCP-4885 seems to have no eyes. Should a person learn of SCP-4885's current location, Waldo will simultaneously gain an awareness of this person. Learning instantly of their victim's location, SCP-4885 will traverse any space necessary, tracking their target down to anywhere they might be in the world. The creature has displayed a number of space-altering abilities, including teleportation. SCP-4885 can also alter the state of his own matter, allowing Waldo to phase through solid surfaces. No obstacle can stop his advance. Not walls, not buildings, not even his victim's own body. When SCP-4885 finally reaches the person who has learned of his location, Waldo will then proceed to murder them in an exceptionally excruciating manner. Using his matter-changing abilities, he will teleport or phase himself inside his victim, pulling himself through their body and destroying their internal organs. After causing catastrophic bodily damage, SCP-4885 will then wrench their victim's jaw open, unhinging it with enough force to climb his way out of their mouth, leaving them dead, their body completely mangled. However, this isn't even the final stage of Waldo's attack. There is a strange byproduct left after a fatal encounter with SCP-4885, a yellow liquid that is produced as Waldo exits his victim's body. When this substance comes into contact with the deceased person's skin, it triggers a bizarre change. The liquid will cause their bodies to change after death, their skin becoming covered in symbols. On closer inspection, it becomes clear that these symbols are illustrations, exactly like the ones found in the pages of Where's Waldo. These corpses, referred to by the Foundation as instances of SCP-4885-1, will then start to act in a similar manner to SCP-4885, and anyone who sees one or learns of its location will cause Waldo to come looking for them. The Where's Waldo scenes left on a deceased victim's skin cannot be washed off or otherwise removed, and the only way to undo an instance of SCP-4885-1 is to skin an infected body after death. However, this creates a whole new problem. If someone was to attempt this, in doing so they would know the location of one of Waldo's victims. This knowledge would mean that whomever was trying to skin one of these bodies would themselves become Waldo's next target, and would likely end up just another instance of SCP-4885-1. In other words, it would be an exercise in futility. Naturally, the nature of visibilities and attack patterns make it difficult for the SCP Foundation to contain Waldo. SCP-4885 cannot be harmed through the use of firearms or other common conventional weapons at the Foundation's disposal. You might be forgiven for thinking that making a handful of people aware of where to find Waldo at the same time would be a viable solution. After all, he cannot be in multiple places at once, so perhaps he'd be unable to kill these individuals simultaneously. However, SCP-4885 has shown to be able to cope with this approach, dispatching his victims one at a time, transforming each in turn into Where's Waldo printed corpses before continuing to the next would-be victim. If the victim is nearby, Waldo will force himself into their mouth, passing through their body and destroying bones, organs, and even the spinal column. When his victim is further away, Waldo will phase through the nearest wall and attack them, teleporting into his target and then climbing out of their mouth. Waldo's location or that of his victims' bodies are considered info hazards. Simply being aware of this information will cause SCP-4885 to activate. As a result of this, the staff at the SCP Foundation are not even sure that Waldo is actually contained at all. In theory, SCP-4885 is being held at an undisclosed Foundation site within a non-designed containment chamber, since even a number on the door would tip off what's inside, triggering Waldo's abilities. But here's the clincher, because nobody can know for sure where Waldo is without him coming for them. Nobody at the Foundation actually knows where he's being contained, if he's even contained at all. It is worth noting that, if someone receives a vague, non-specific description of Waldo's whereabouts, that he will make no attempt to seek them out. If he is contained, and if he was to ever breach containment, then the SCP Foundation has an entire set of procedures in place to ensure that no one ever finds Waldo. First, 36 containment chambers identical to the one SCP-4885 is supposedly held in are connected to a self-driving vehicle. An expendable D-Class personnel member is placed into the vehicle and a random number generator will select a number from 1 to 36. The self-driving vehicle will then arrive at the containment chamber chosen at random and the D-Class placed inside. Within each chamber are digital monitors, and once the D-Class is inside the chamber, all of these monitors will display the current location of SCP-4885. The Foundation has kept a GPS tracking device implanted within Waldo, but this information is normally kept secret to avoid any containment breaches. The D-Class essentially acts as bait for Waldo, forcibly given the knowledge of his location so that SCP-4885 will consider them a target. As part of the next phase of containment, Foundation staff will wait, giving Waldo enough time to arrive in the containment chamber and dispatch the D-Class within. After this, all of the 36 containment chambers are transported to random Foundation sites in disguised trucks, so that no one is sure where SCP-4885 ends up. Every time SCP-4885 breaches containment, the entire procedure has to be repeated. The Foundation first encountered SCP-4885 a number of years ago, inside a small wooden house, the exact location of which has since been expunged from all the SCP Foundation's records. While on assignment to secure an entirely different anomaly, the Foundation's Mobile Task Force Chi-19, also codenamed Unrelenting Punishment, were the first to discover Waldo. The three-person unit consisted of Foundation operatives named Amelia Merrick, James Klein, and Kurt Stoll. The trio cautiously entered the wooden house where they were meant to investigate reports of an anomalous inanimate object, a pair of black spectacles. According to initial intelligence gathered by the SCP Foundation, these glasses were capable of killing anyone that tried to wear them, leaving their body covered in pictures like those found in the children's book. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It is unknown if these black spectacles are the same eyewear worn by SCP-4885, but it doesn't seem like too far of a leap to assume that this may well have been the case. Searching the ground floor, the team had found no sign of the object they had been sent to recover. As Amelia, Kurt, and James made their way upstairs, something began making scraping sounds beneath them, but none of them noticed. In an abandoned bedroom on the upstairs floor of the house, Kurt spotted a drawing on the wall, which looked to have been made using crayons. He took a photo of the illustration, and this image is still kept in the Foundation's database. It appears to be a child's drawing, depicting SCP-4885 wearing his signature striped shirt and hat, with empty, vacant eyes. Next to it was scrawled one simple phrase: Waldo found Mommy. Continuing their way through the house, the team located the glasses they were looking for in an upstairs bathroom. However, as James bagged up the spectacles, ready for transport back to the Foundation, Kurt spotted another inscription on a nearby wall, one that the team were certain hadn't been there when they had arrived. James stepped in to translate using the Foundation's standard issue translation device. The phrase on the wall read, "The basement. The corpses from a child's book are in the basement. He is there too. And we're sure that you can already guess what happened after that." Immediately after reading these words, James began to groan and clutched at his stomach, showing signs of extreme pain. Before Amelia or Kurt had any chance to figure out what was happening to their squadmate, fingers began protruding from James's mouth. They gripped his jaw and pulled it apart with enough force to send his jawbone flying across the room. SCP-4885 climbed its way out of James's body, and Amelia and Kurt both opened fire on the creature. Waldo did not react, seemingly unfazed by the gunfire and sustaining no damage as he approached Amelia, who would be his next victim. Shoving his fingers into her throat, Waldo wrenched apart Amelia's jaw, breaking it before he clawed his way into her mouth. As he watched in horror, Kurt made a panicked call for help to the Foundation, but it was too late. Waldo had already dispatched both James and Amelia, and now Kurt was about to pay the same terrible price. Ever since this incident, the Foundation believes that they have SCP-4885 contained. When his file was created, their researchers created an automated algorithm designed to wipe away any mention of SCP-4885's current location or the house he was discovered in from Foundation records. With SCP-4885 now assumed to be contained, that only leaves one question. The same burning inquiry that's been plaguing man for decades. Where's Waldo? In this case, maybe it's safer if you didn't know. There's no doubt that the SCP Foundation has come across some dangerous anomalies over the years. If you had to guess, what would you say is the most dangerous SCP they have in containment? A lot of people might immediately think of SCP-682, the hard-to-destroy reptile. And perhaps they might be right. After all, we're talking about a gigantic lizard that can regenerate almost all forms of damage, and harbors a burning hatred for any and all other forms of life. Then there's the various eldritch entities the Foundation has come into contact with, beings that could easily rewrite all of reality out of pure anger, or just to torment us for their own amusement. But the most dangerous SCP might well be something completely unassuming. Instead of a zombie-producing plague doctor or an actual plague of flesh-eating zombies, imagine if there was just a man. One seemingly ordinary human man. Nothing about him that looks unusual, no mimetic or anomalous superpower. And yet one look at him tells you that he's the most dangerous man you've ever seen. Someone who should be locked up forever for all the horrible things he's done. Welcome to the story of Fraser Melbrook, the most dangerous person, also known as SCP-3017. To anyone that knew him, Fraser was just an ordinary man. Although at 25 years of age, he had not exactly lived a charmed life. People would look at him and could almost tell there was something unsavory about Fraser's character. It was as if one glance could somehow tell you that he was trouble. It was this unshakable feeling that he gave people that led to Fraser Melbrook being arrested and arrested and arrested some more. Over the course of his adult life, he was placed under arrest a total of 23 times. Fraser was suspected of having committed a number of different crimes, ranging from robbery and assault all the way up to accusations of murder. Interestingly, he was never formally indicted for any of his alleged crimes, meaning he was only ever arrested and held as a suspect. but never once was he confirmed to have been guilty. There was never any evidence, nothing to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Frazier was, in fact, a criminal. Instead, every arrest boiled down to the way he made people in his presence feel. Unfortunately, even though he was never proven to be guilty or even capable of committing the crimes he was accused of, Frazier Melbrook's multiple arrests garnered him a notable criminal record and soon drew the attention of the SCP Foundation. When he was transferred into Foundation Containment and designated as SCP-3017, it was believed that Frazier had some form of connection to a number of groups of interest. These are various organizations that the Foundation monitors, viewing them as causes for concern and sometimes outright threats. This list includes the Church of the Broken God, a cult of religious zealots that worship an entity that combines a number of SCPs, as well as the Global Occult Coalition, a gung-ho organization policing the paranormal that shares an uneasy history with the Foundation. However, no member of staff could explain exactly why they thought Frazier Melbrook had any connection to these groups. There was no evidence that he was, but still, they had a hunch. And so testing began. Hours upon hours of rigorous interviews and experimentation trying to understand what it was that made people want to keep this seemingly ordinary man locked up. After extensive research was conducted by Foundation personnel, they were able to determine why SCP-3017 had been arrested so many times before, and what had drawn the Foundation to him in the first place. Frazier Melbrook was suffering from a cognitohazard. This was a condition that did not so much have a direct adverse effect on him, but rather influenced those around him. Anyone that stood close enough to SCP-3017 or made an attempt to engage him directly in conversation, even those that just looked at him, all reacted the same way. Frazier gave people the overwhelming belief that he needed to be placed in custody, even if he'd not said or done anything to give them a reason to. Anyone that looked at, spoke to, or even stood near him became spontaneously aware that SCP-3017 was some sort of dangerous criminal. The cognitohazard didn't give people knowledge of his exact crimes. It more just made them believe that Frazier had a violent disposition and that he needed to be locked away. Any person staying within the vicinity of SCP-3017 for an hour or longer would experience further effects of Frazier's cognitohazard. Beyond just knowing there was something untoward about him, those who spent extended time around SCP-3017 would actively try to restrain him, and then after an hour, they would exhibit violent behavior towards him. They would start obsessively trying to ensure that he was incarcerated, almost like the thought of him being free was so horrifying that they couldn't help but try to arrest him themselves. Luckily, these effects of longer exposure to Frazier were not permanent, and often the subject's tendencies to try to restrain him could be cured through amnestics. The effects of Frazier Melbrook's cognitohazardous condition seemed to change relative to the amount of time he remained incarcerated. After continuous exposure to SCP-3017, the effects of his cognitohazard would appear to fade, meaning that those who had previously been compelled to incarcerate him would later become indifferent, or even release him freely. This caused a problem for the Foundation and raised a very important question. How do you contain someone that you later feel the urge to set free? The answer was designated SCP-3017-1, a list of individuals with a connection to Frazier Melbrook, all of whom had seemingly become immune to the outward effects of his condition. Not one of these people could be convinced that Frazier was a violent criminal that everyone else saw. Among the list of names were Frazier's parents, Vivian and Beck, along with his siblings, grandmother, former classmates, and romantic partners, and his fiancée, Nadia. But you might be wondering, how did the SCP Foundation use nothing more than a list of names to keep SCP-3017 caged? By threatening them, of course. Researchers who interviewed Frazier found that they could greatly decrease the secondary effect of his condition, making them far less compelled to free him. All it took was them to tell Frazier that his family, friends, fiancé would be captured, tortured, or even killed if he tried to escape containment. According to the Foundation, this didn't stop Frazier from trying to escape, though. His file states that he actively made several attempts to breach containment, all of which failed. The truth, however, was that just about any move that Frazier made was misinterpreted as an attempted escape. In one instance, while trying just to use the bathroom, SCP-3017 was tackled and restrained by a Foundation guard. You see, Frazier knew that just like with his previous arrests, he'd done nothing to deserve being locked up and interrogated by the SCP Foundation. But to the eyes of everyone around him, he was a dangerous threat. The researchers and guards treated him like a monster, because as far as they saw, he was one. By manipulating information about the current health of his loved ones, like telling him his grandmother had developed lung cancer, the Foundation kept Frazier under lock and key. Hearing threats against his friends and family, or bad news about their current state quickly put an end to SCP-3017's attempts at escape. Even though he was frustrated with the Foundation, he was without hope and had little choice in the matter. So Frazier did his best to comply with his captors and offer the SCP Foundation information on groups of interest he thought they wanted to hear, even though he had no affiliation with any of them. By bringing Frazier's fiancée, Nadia, into containment and showing him a live video feed of her, Foundation researcher Dr. Kiran hoped to coax a wealth of valuable information out of SCP-3017. Afraid for his partner's life, Frazier did his best to answer their questions, and Nadia was later freed and given amnestics to forget the incident. But Foundation researcher Rylan was quick to realize that the information Dr. Kiran had extracted from SCP-3017 didn't seem to add up. Frazier, of course, had no knowledge about any groups of interest, and had to improvise to protect his fiancée. Researcher Rylan picked up on this, remarking that SCP-3017's information could not be considered reliable. But she was unsure if Frazier was hiding something or simply didn't know anything. During another interrogation, Frazier's brother, a former classmate, and two former romantic partners were brought into the Foundation and sedated. In an adjacent room, Frazier was threatened by Dr. Kiran with a handgun and made sure to answer further questions. Every time he didn't, the doctor threatened to shoot one of Frazier's loved ones. It was after this incident that researcher Rylan once again reassessed the information given by SCP-3017. Finally, she came to realize that there was no evidence of Frazier's criminal history, nor was there anything tying him to groups of interest. Everything that the Foundation had thought of him was just a result of SCP-3017's condition, and he genuinely had none of the information they'd been seeking. He was only answering their questions to protect the lives of people he cared for. Realizing the huge ethical mistake the Foundation had made, essentially psychologically torturing Frazier for information he simply didn't have, researcher Rylan begged her superiors that SCP-3017 be released. The request was denied, and instead Rylan was contained, believed to be a new instance of SCP-3017-1. With the help of security officer Rudolph Cardiad, who had guarded Frazier, Rylan escaped her own cell and the pair of them triggered a containment alarm. In the ensuing confusion, Rylan and Cardiad freed SCP-3017 from his incarceration, and she and Frazier escaped the containment facility where Officer Cardiad was captured and contained by security personnel. Rylan brought Frazier to what she thought was safety of his family's home, but neither of them expected to see what awaited them. The house had been burned to the ground, with almost all of Frazier's family inside. His parents, siblings, grandmother, fiancé, and even neighbor had all perished in a fire that had engulfed the one place in the world that Frazier hadn't been held against his will. It is still unclear if the fire was intentionally started by a member of the SCP Foundation to drive SCP-3017 back into containment, or had merely been an unfortunate accident. But notably, Dr. Kiran had been strangely absent during SCP-3017 and Rylan's escape from the Foundation. Overwhelmed with grief and despair, Frazier was last seen on a bridge not far from his childhood home, and researcher Rylan was recaptured without resistance by Foundation personnel near the same spot. With SCP-3017 gone along with his cognitohazardous effects, both her and Security Officer Cardiad were reinstated back to full employment with the Foundation. The Foundation then reclassified SCP-3017 as neutralized, quietly avoiding the truth of their mistake. All records of his supposed criminal activity and links to anomalous groups were stricken from the record as unsubstantiated. He had been innocent all along, just a man who had never done anything he was accused of and didn't deserve to be locked away. The SCP Foundation had tortured Frazier, asking him questions he didn't have the answers to, using the love he had for those closest to him as a way to try and goad him into giving the Foundation what they wanted, and in the end, may have been responsible for multiple innocent people being murdered. Perhaps it was easier for them to stamp neutralized on his file than to actually face up what they'd done to him. The Foundation has spent at least a century containing anomalies and monsters, but the hardest monsters to contain are often the ones that emerge within us, and nothing better illustrates that than the Foundation's monstrous treatment of SCP-3017.
On a cold October night in 2003, Shirley Yates of Seattle, Washington was just about to get ready for bed when she heard a knock at the door. She approached the door and asked the person on the other side to identify themselves. The voice outside responded immediately. It was a salesman who just wanted a few moments of Mrs. Yates' time. This was odd for two reasons. First, it was almost 10 o'clock at night, much later than is usual for door-to-door salesmen. And second, the knock hadn't come from Mrs. Yates's front door. It was coming from the door to her bathroom. Has your home ever been visited by a door-to-door salesman? If you were born in the last 40 years, then your answer to that question is probably no. In the age of online shopping, the idea of a salesperson going from house to house hawking vacuum cleaners or encyclopedia sets feels like a relic from the past. It's highly unlikely you'd ever see one walking the streets nowadays, and equally unlikely that one would knock on your front door. However, if you live in Washington State, you might need to be wary of a certain salesman who is still doing the rounds. SCP-1879, also known as the Indoor Salesman and the Doorman, is a phenomenon that manifests randomly in homes throughout Washington. Subjects will hear persistent knocking from the interior doors of their homes, and the affected door becomes classified as SCP-1879-1. The knocking doesn't stop until the door is opened, at which point the subject will be greeted by SCP-1879-2, a Caucasian man of indeterminate age standing around 170 centimeters tall. The man will claim to be a salesman and immediately try to pitch a bizarre product to the subject whose home he's just invaded. The SCP Foundation was first alerted to the existence of the indoor salesman when they had intercepted a 911 call coming from the home of Mrs. Shirley Yates. She had opened the door to her bathroom in an attempt to get the salesman to stop knocking, and once he was in her home, he refused to leave. According to Yates, he kept disappearing in and out of random doors in her house. Foundation Field Agent Rogers was equipped with a recording device and sent in to investigate the case with several other agents. When he arrived at the home, he found Mrs. Yates inconsolable. SCP-1879-2 was still rapidly talking at her, and strangely enough, the product he was holding and trying to sell to her was a Border Collie puppy. As soon as Agent Rogers entered the room, the man shifted his attention away from Mrs. Yates and towards him. He then started trying to sell the puppy to Agent Rogers. Agent Rogers did not want to purchase this puppy, but he found that the man spoke so quickly and urgently, he couldn't get a word in edgewise. The man was begging Rogers to take the puppy, practically shoving it in his face, saying that he didn't need any money, and that the only payment he needed would be some of your time. Rogers grew so annoyed at being talked over and interrupted that he ordered the other field agents to apprehend the indoor salesman. They did so, but as soon as the agents walked him out of the front door of the house, he disappeared without a trace. The agents remained in the area to monitor the situation. SCP-1879-2 manifested again in Mrs. Yates's home 6 hours later, still trying to trade the puppy for no money, just a little of her time. 12 years, to be precise. After hours and hours of being worn down by this supernaturally pushy salesman, Yates relented and agreed to take the puppy, and immediately disappeared. The indoor salesman then disappeared himself through the closet door before he could be apprehended again. At a loss for what to do, the agents administered Class A amnestics to Mrs. Yates's family and left. The reason for her disappearance wasn't fully known until 12 years later in 2015, when she reappeared in the same spot she disappeared from, having no concept of how much time had passed. The puppy really had just cost her 12 years of her life. Stories like that of Shirley Yates have popped up all over the state in the years since, from Everett to Walla Walla and everywhere in between. Due to the random nature of SCP-1879 events and the way the indoor salesman can disappear instantly in and out of any door in a building, the SCP Foundation has been unable to capture him. The best they've been able to do is monitor 911 calls from across the state, listening for keywords that might indicate another SCP-1879 infestation. When such an event is reported, the Foundation deploys Mobile Task Force Row 4, aka Shoes Salesman. This task force's entire purpose is to minimize the amount of harm the indoor salesman is able to cause by intercepting him before he can make a sale. This is a very important task, as evidenced by the story of Mrs. Yates, since while the products this salesman sells might be innocent, he doesn't accept payment in any normal currency. The price he asks for his products are always bizarre and often deadly. If all someone loses is 12 years of their life, they could be considered to be getting off easy. In one instance, the product being sold was a single red rose in exchange for the subject's heart. Once the deal was sealed, the subject dropped dead on the spot, with an autopsy revealing that his heart and circulatory system vanished from inside his body. In another, the indoor salesman offered 220 bananas and told the subject to simply give him some sugar. The subject agreed, and all candied goods in the home disappeared. In a third, the indoor salesman was trying to sell a thermonuclear warhead, the price of which was the subject's soul. The subject accepted, and at first nothing seemed to have happened. The Foundation confiscated the warhead and placed it into non-anomalous containment. Later that day, the subject went to listen to some music, only to find that 2 of her vinyl records had gone missing: Lady Soul and Almighty Fire by world-famous soul singer Aretha Franklin. So, even though he's incredibly invasive, annoying, and his transactions can be deadly, the indoor salesman still maintains a sense of humor. The fact that the Foundation can't capture the indoor salesman means that a lot of questions about him remain unanswered. The biggest by far is why he does what he does. In most SCP-1879 events, the indoor salesman seems frantic and desperate to make a sale. Often he will refer to having quotas and deadlines to meet, which implies some other unseen entity that he has to answer to. These questions remain unanswered because all attempts to interrogate the indoor salesman have been unsuccessful. When he manifests in a location, it's impossible to get him to stray from a sales pitch, and he disappears as soon as he successfully sells his wares. However, there was one instance where, after an SCP-1879 event took place, Foundation agents were there to witness a rare interaction between the indoor salesman and his mysterious employers. Agent Rogers and the rest of the shoes salesmen were called out to a home in Spokane, where rapid knocking had begun to emanate from the bedroom door. Equipped with recording devices, Rogers was able to record the voice of the indoor salesman coming from inside the bedroom. In the recording, the salesman grumbled to himself about not being able to meet his quota by tomorrow, saying that if he didn't, he'd be stuck in this world for the next century. He started knocking again, yelling through the door that he knew they were home. He kept knocking until he was interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing. The indoor salesman was heard picking it up, and Rogers managed to record the conversation. The person calling was, apparently, the indoor salesman's boss, who was calling to complain about his performance. Only one side of the conversation was heard, but evidently the indoor salesman's boss wasn't too happy about receiving 2 Aretha Franklin albums as payment instead of an actual human soul. The indoor salesman apologized for the joke, then told his boss, "It won't happen again, please don't hurt it. I'll meet the quota this time, I swear." He hung up, grumbling to himself again, "I better get to move up to at least accounting this time. I've paid my dues and then some." Rogers finally opened the door to the apparent disappointment of the indoor salesman, who was hoping to speak with the home's owner and was quite annoyed at having another one of his sales interrupted by MTF Row 4. Rogers tried to ask the indoor salesman who he'd just been speaking to on the phone, but as usual, the salesman started talking over him. "Now see here, let's think logically," he said. "You know I'm not going to tell you anything. I know you're not likely to buy what I'm selling. So let's just move on to greener pastures. I'm coming up close to a deadline, and I'm sure you're swamped with making sure good people don't lose their jobs, so I'll just be on my way and let you do that. Ciao." The indoor salesman tried to close the door, but Agent Rogers blocked it with his arm. He was tired of this SCP giving him the runaround, and he was going to keep the indoor salesman here if it was the last thing he did. He demanded the entity stay and be interviewed, and other members of the task force apprehended the salesman, making sure he couldn't leave the room. The indoor salesman, now held in place by several armed men, seemed to finally relent. He told Rogers,
I'm busy, so I'll tell you what. I'm going to give you something, no money out of your pocket, and we'll call it even. Sound good?
Rogers, just wanting to get this whole thing over with, agreed to those terms. 3 seconds later, every agent on the scene was dead, and the indoor salesman was able to straighten his tie, pick up his briefcase, and walk through the door to the bathroom. When the bodies of Agent Rogers and the rest of the MTF Row 4 were examined by Foundation scientists, the cause of death was found to be, in every case, thousands of coins suddenly appearing in not only their pockets, but also inside their stomachs, lungs, and even under their skin. Later that day, the indoor salesman was reported at a home in the same neighborhood. He was seen trying to sell the house's owner, 80-year-old retiree Alan Johnson, a Glock 18 pistol in exchange for his attention. As he had done so many times before, the indoor salesman disappeared through another door before the Foundation was able to reach the scene. And when the SCP arrived, they found Mr. Johnson still alive, but now missing his prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that controls attention. It's likely that, because of the nature of the entity, SCP-1879 might be entirely impossible to contain. The Foundation might never find out anything more than what they already know about the indoor salesman, the way he's able to manifest behind closed doors, or the reason he has to keep filling quotas for an unseen boss who apparently doesn't have a very good sense of humor. So, if you're ever in Washington State, be careful who you open your doors to, especially if the knocking you hear is coming from inside your house. The year is 1941, and the world is gripped by the most violent and widespread war in history. Millions march to war as bloody battles are fought across the globe. Horrendous atrocities are carried out on groups of people, and parts of London are bombed to rubble on a weekly basis. Considering it's only been 20 years since the last World War, it must seem to the early residents of the early 20th century that the world is coming apart at the seams. And amongst the chaos, it'd be easy not to notice a secluded manor house in the English countryside disappearing without a trace for 11 days, before suddenly returning to our reality. But thankfully, one organization makes it its sole duty to notice the unnoticeable and understand the impossible: the SCP Foundation. And within that anomalous manor house, Foundation agents and researchers were about to find horrors beyond even their darkest imaginations. This is the grim tale of SCP-1461, better known as the House of the Worm. When the manor house reappeared after its 11-day absence, the Foundation zeroed in, sending agents inside to investigate. It was a 2-level dwelling complete with 12 bedrooms, 4 baths, 3 studies, a main foyer/ballroom, a library, a kitchen, and a pantry basement. The Foundation observed that a number of these rooms had been fitted with rows of bunk beds, similar to a boarding house or barracks. Only later would they understand why. They found that the upper portion of the home exhibited no abnormal qualities whatsoever, but as the agents investigated further, they found an entrance to the truly anomalous portion of the manor, the extensive sub-level system. No previous records of the building kept by the local council indicated that there would be anything below the manor's basement, so either the mysterious previous occupants, who were nowhere to be found, had built this sub-level, or had just appeared here on its own. Regardless of which was the case, agents and researchers knew that whatever had happened down here had everything to do with the manor's mysterious disappearance. They descended into the depths of what seemed like a man-made cave system, constructed primarily from a mix of concrete, iron, and brass. It was a behemoth of 20th century technology, intricate snaking systems of pipes, gears, and pumping pistons. It was like someone had built an entire factory down here. But for what? The agents began to spread out through the labyrinthian bowels of the manor, hoping to find some answers. But all they seemed to discover was more questions. This place hadn't been built with any form of comprehensible logic. It was full of dead ends, stairways that ascended and descended to nowhere,
doors that would open to reveal just walls behind them or not open at all. It was like a maze built by a maniac. It didn't help that it looked like the place was recently hit by an earthquake, with some passages caved in and mangled machinery strewn about. It seemed that no human workers had interfered with the impossibly complex and bizarre machinery in quite some time. A number of the materials used to construct said machinery, as well as the gray sandstone filling in the collapsed passageways, remain unidentified to this day. Already, the sublevel was proving to be a complex puzzle box with only an estimated 75% of its layout ultimately being mapped by Foundation researchers. However, they would soon realize that this place wasn't just confusing, it was deadly. The only method of self-maintenance detected by the exploring agents were pipes that would fire a thick black lubricant onto the surrounding machinery. One of the Foundation agents had the misfortune of getting covered in it while exploring a darkened passageway, and 80% of his body was melted as a result. It appeared that the viscous black goo was incredibly corrosive to all organic matter. A number of the machines also emitted dangerously high quantities of gamma and X-ray radiation, making it difficult to explore many of the caverns without heavy hazmat protection. And worst of all, were the extremely hostile creatures living in the caves who would regularly attack Foundation personnel. These abominations came to be known as SCP-1461-1, vicious steampunk Frankenstein monsters, once human, but with large parts of their bodies replaced by crude mechanical implants, including metal teeth and claws. 1461-1s have displayed a taste for human flesh, and they have dragged multiple Foundation agents down into their lair to be converted into monsters like them. It's believed that SCP-1461 is capable of controlling these beasts through the strategic use of sound from its brass-speaking pipes, leading them into areas where Foundation personnel are present to instigate conflict. Many of these pitiful creatures have had their throats replaced by phonographs, endlessly repeating the same nonsense phrases over and over again. I am what you have made me. I am choice, and I am tyranny. Forgive me. I am then and I am now, what gods they will be then. I am evil and I am flesh. I am the trap. I am beauty and I am chaos. Children are selfish. I am the worm. I have broken God. Still, in spite of the mazes, monsters, and deadly chemicals, the agents persisted and managed to discover several important locations. The gel production chamber on sublevel 3 creates glass jars from the unidentified sandstone and fills them with a slime that looks to contain living eyes and teeth. The factory deliveries room is filled with a huge number of crates and boxes, which seem to shift and change in number between Foundation patrols. The speaking tube room on sublevel 11 contains a grand pulpit that acts as the connecting point for the complex array of speaking tubes running through the entire cave system. The body parts of a deceased female also appear to be wired into the machinery, like spare parts. And on sublevel 12, they found the so-called catalyst room. Here they discovered a huge, complicated, clockwork and steam-powered machine that appeared to be broken and missing some parts. Most horrifying of all, though, is the raised platform in the center of the catalyst room, on top of which is a metal hospital bed. A desiccated male corpse rests upon the bed, its chest punctured by large syringes connected by tubes to some kind of pumping machine. The parts connecting this pumping machine to the overall apparatus of the room were missing, though, leaving its purpose a mystery. The Foundation assumed that fluids used to be drawn out of this corpse to somehow power the machine. You may be starting to worry that there doesn't seem to be any answers here, that this house is one big mystery. But lucky for you, you're wrong. An old journal was also discovered in the catalyst room, and if what was written inside is to be believed, then we may finally have some truth about who created the House of the Worm, why it was created, and what horrible events triggered its mysterious disappearance and reappearance. His true name has been redacted by the Foundation, and special efforts have been made to maintain secrecy around the house, seeing as it's an anomaly of great interest to a cult known as the Church of the Broken God. So we'll just call the one who made this place the Inventor. Before any of this, the Inventor was one of the many Englishmen traumatized and almost killed in the horrific trench battles of World War I. After a near-death experience, the Inventor, like many geniuses and madmen,
was plagued by surreal and nightmarish visions. He saw a huge creature that he referred to as the Worm, a gigantic metal monstrosity with dragon-like jaws full of gnashing gears that rampaged through Europe, destroying and devouring everything in its path. These apocalyptic visions also presented him with a solution, vague blueprints for a machine that might be the salvation of him and others willing to take his new gospel to heart. An escape from a world that the inventor knew in his heart was about to end. He hired work-starved laborers from across the country to help him make his visions a reality, and began a massive secret construction project beneath his isolated country manor house. For the inventor, it was all a labor of love. He wanted to protect his wife, son, and daughter from the terrible jaws of the Worm. But as the project stretched on, his wife began to suspect that he'd lost his mind. Many of his workers, however, felt just the opposite. They became infatuated by the inventor's sermons on the nature of the Worm and the coming apocalypse they hoped to escape. Soon enough, they had become a bona fide cult, constructing the elaborate sublevels underneath the house in preparation for the fast-approaching day of reckoning. Then came World War II. The inventor saw Hitler, hungry for war, as one of the avatars of the Worm. Finally, knowing that the time was right, he activated the machine and successfully trapped the Worm in the bowels of his mechanized home. However, as the Blitz raged and London's bombing began, the inventor felt as though he hadn't stopped anything. He realized once and for all that he was never meant to stop the apocalypse, only escape it. And by throwing the final switch and setting the machine he and his followers had built into overdrive, he did just that. This was the moment that the House of the Worm disappeared, transporting the inventor, his family, and his devoted staff to a different world. An empty gray world, devoid of war but also lacking all the comforts of regular life, including food. Things went downhill from there, as their supplies quickly began to run out, and the cult descended into cannibalism in order to survive. Things weren't going much better in the inventor's personal life. His wife, fearing what would happen to the family, took her own life and the life of his daughter. Though by this point, the inventor's mind was so fractured that it's possible he may have killed them himself. Either way, it was only the inventor and his son left, and more trouble was brewing. Eudora, one of the staff trapped in the building with the inventor and his cult, started a mutiny. She claimed the Worm spoke to her from below, and that their only path to salvation was pleasing the Worm. How would they please it? A sacrifice, of course. They would give it the son of the man who had trapped it. The mutineers took the inventor's only remaining child and descended into the lowest sublevels. The inventor followed, hoping to track them down, save his son, and salvage something from this nightmare. As he ventured deeper, battling the members of Eudora's new cult, he found that they were changing themselves, becoming the half-human cyborg creatures that the Foundation would later discover. The inventor would find Eudora herself in the speaking tube room. Her body, still living, was wired into the machinery, and she had sacrificed his son to the Worm. In a rage, the inventor murdered Eudora, or whatever was left of her, then heard a familiar voice speaking out of a nearby speaking tube. It said, "I am what you have made me. I am then, and I am now. I am choice, and I am tyranny. I am evil, and I am flesh. I am beauty, and I am chaos. I am the Worm." The voice was his own. In that terrible moment, the inventor realized that the Worm wasn't a giant all-devouring monster. It was him. In trying to protect his loved one from a perceived apocalypse, he'd brought them all to their horrible demise. He'd trapped them with the monster he'd hoped for them all to escape from, because no matter what you build, you can't escape from who you are. Grief-stricken and broken, the inventor descended into the catalyst room. There was his son, stuck with the syringes, drained of all life to fuel the mighty machine his father had created. In his last moments, the inventor decided to do the only noble thing. He threw himself into the machine, destroying both it and himself in the process. The house was transported back to our own reality, but the Worm, in a sense, was no more. But who knows if the Worm is really dead? Its thoughts and poisonous intent still lingers in the caverns and rattles through the speaking pipes. Whatever really happened, the Foundation is still picking up the pieces today, and who knows what lurks in the parts still hidden from our knowledge. It all started in 1983 with reports of human trafficking in the heart of Sin City. The FBI had gotten word of a potential trafficking ring operating out of an abandoned department store in Las Vegas, Nevada, and immediately began organizing a secret raid on the building. While they would indeed encounter something horrifying within that abandoned department store, it wasn't criminals or human trafficking. In fact, it wasn't human at all. This is the horrifying story of SCP-847. After weeks of planning, the raid on the department store was conducted in the dead of night. Agents covered all the exits and entrances, and a helicopter was stationed nearby in case anyone attempted to run. It should have been a perfect trap, but things never go as planned when you don't know what you're dealing with. The agents breached the door and began searching the darkened building. It didn't appear that there was any power, so the traffickers must have had great night vision and a high tolerance for creepy locales. Agents soon heard a faint humming sound coming from below, a generator. It must be located in the basement and be the hub of this criminal enterprise. Readying themselves for whatever they were about to find, the agents descended into the basement. As they moved deeper into the building, they found that lighting rigs had been set up. They must be getting closer to something, but that something was still a mystery. A senior FBI special agent was leading the charge, his pistol drawn and ready. It was quiet. Too quiet. Did the traffickers already realize they were coming and clear out? He was ready to consider this bust a bust when he heard a quiet mewling in the distance, a persistent whining whimper that was undeniably human. He gave the signal to his fellow agents to follow the noise. They proceeded forward towards the pain sounds and found themselves in a wide, well-lit room filled with department store mannequins. All were broken to some degree. Some were totally smashed to pieces. Some were chained to walls and locked in cages. Others were wrapped in plastic. The agent wondered whether this was some kind of twisted joke or a messed up avant-garde art piece. That's when he noticed her, a single crouched figure in the distance, hunched over and whimpering in a darkened corner of the room near a full-length mirror. He couldn't fully make her out, but he got the sense that something was wrong. She was injured, bent over. Was she even missing an arm? Just what had these monsters done to this woman? He whispered a request for backup into his radio and pushed on. When he got within 50 meters of this strange woman, her demeanor changed entirely. She jerked around, her movements forced, erratic, and painful looking. The woman stared directly into the agent's eyes and began hobbling towards him, occasionally stopping to strike a pose as if modeling during a photo shoot. Just then, the agent made a horrifying realization. This thing moving towards them wasn't a woman at all. It was a living mannequin. As she got closer though, he realized that the mannequin's broken left forearm had been carved into a large shiv. A female junior FBI agent had been one of the many to pour into the room when the raid leader had radioed for backup. The second she entered the 50-meter range of this strange mannequin, everything changed. In an instant, its eyes and mouth began dripping with a thick, viscous resin. Its whimpering gasps suddenly became vicious, ear-splitting screeches, and it turned its gaze from the senior FBI agent. It was now focused on the junior agent, who had just entered the room and broke into a terrifying run straight towards her. The mannequin moved with a violent, single-minded purpose. Other agents began firing, but it was running freakishly fast and easily dodged most of the bullets. The few that actually hit seemed to do nothing to slow the creature down. It shrugged off the damage and kept running. With a great leap, it landed on the terrified junior agent and began jabbing her with its bladed arm. The other agents stopped firing, fearing they might accidentally hit their colleague during the panic. The mannequin was ruthless, clawing and stabbing with the strange resin leaking out of its every orifice. Terrified and unable to reach her gun, the agent remembered her training. She reached into her belt and grabbed her stun gun, jamming the two probes up against the creature's chest and giving it 30,000 volts. The creature spasmed, fell backwards, and collapsed in a heap on the ground, frozen. This was the first recorded encounter with SCP-847, a violent living mannequin with a serious problem with women. This terrifying report was passed up the chain of command until it landed on the desk of a Foundation agent working in the FBI. The Foundation quickly swooped in and claimed the mannequin, delivered necessary amnestic treatment to all who'd witnessed it, and closely observed the female junior FBI agent's recovery in a private hospital with Foundation ties. As it turns out, they were right to do so, as the junior agent was in for a gruesome fate. While the wound she'd suffered at the hands of SCP-847 didn't appear fatal, the fact that the mannequin's anomalous resin excretions entered the open wound changed everything. Several hours after being committed, the junior agent began complaining of limb stiffness and difficulty moving. This quickly developed into full paralysis. Over time, her skin and internal organs began to harden, until the process, dubbed plastination, came to a gruesome end. The junior agent wasn't just dead, she had been transformed into a mannequin. Foundation researchers were met with a truly horrifying realization. This means that all the other broken mannequins found with SCP-847 were likely once living humans, attacked and transformed by the anomaly, now a source for new harvested body parts. Now safely interred at a Foundation containment facility though, the real tests on SCP-847 to determine its behavior and physical attributes could begin. The most important detail about SCP-847 is that its aggression is exclusively directed towards women, as opposed to when it encounters men, and its instincts are more self-destructive. Through a series of tests and observations, researchers have been able to pin down 3 different distinct patterns of behavior for SCP-847. Pattern Z behaviors occur when there are no humans standing within 50 meters of SCP-847. The mannequin will seek out a full-length mirror and pose in front of it, much like a department store mannequin attempting to show off its clothes. It remains largely inanimate during these periods, and will very occasionally use a finger, or whatever appendage is available, given its habit for self-mutilation, to scratch messages on nearby surfaces. Pattern Y behavior occurs when male humans with XY chromosomes enter a 50-meter radius around SCP-847. Just like its reaction to the male FBI agents who found it, 847 will initially emit vocalizations that seem like whimpering gasps, before making eye contact and striking provocative poses while approaching the subject. It will then remain static and allow the male subject to pose its body. However, after the male subject leaves the area, 847 will enter a state of considerable distress and begin removing or shattering parts of its body. The Foundation has found that the parts removed or shattered are often consistent with parts that the male subjects found displeasing during interactions, showing a masochistic desire to impress. These parts are then harvested back from plastinated victims, which brings us to the most dangerous of its behavior patterns. Pattern X behaviors occur when female humans enter a 50-meter radius around the creature. 847 will immediately become brutally aggressive, switching its noises from whimpers to violent screeches and growls. 847 experiences enhanced physical capabilities during Pattern X states. Its speed has been measured at 45 kilometers per hour, making it as fast as the legendary SCP-096. It's also been shown to exhibit extreme physical strength. It's during this pattern of behavior that it begins excreting its deadly resin, which has been proven to only be dangerous to women. In these states, the only thing capable of reliably pacifying the being is a powerful electric shock. The shock causes the creature's resin to harden, temporarily incapacitating it for roughly 5 minutes. Other conventional weapons and damage has no meaningful effect on SCP-847. After a number of incidents that had sad and violent endings, the Foundation Ethics Committee forbade the use of female D-Class personnel in SCP-847 testing. When it came to female subjects, 847 always slipped into a state of extreme aggression, so instead the Foundation began testing with male subjects in hopes of better understanding the dynamics between human males and SCP-847. Various misogynistic D-Class males were introduced into the containment chamber, which was modeled to look like a bedroom for the purposes of behavioral study. Each one, either during or after their interaction with SCP-847, was told to comment on some aspect they felt dissatisfied with. The mannequin shattered its own chest after hearing it described as being out of proportion. After another D-Class called its nose ugly, the mannequin broke it off. After another said that its hair was out of fashion and commented on its inability to drink, it tore out its hair and liver. All parts were replaced after the experiments. Things took their most violent and upsetting turn yet with the introduction of D-7294. A lot of the time, D-Class personnel are considered to be as anonymous as they are expendable, but D-7294 is an exception. Before becoming D-Class, he was a successful cello teacher who brutally murdered one of his teenage students and her mother. He's typically employed in tests when the Foundation wishes to see interactions between anomalies and humans with confirmed psychopathic personalities. During his interaction with SCP-847, he belittled and humiliated the mannequin. He forced it into uncomfortable poses and even snapped off one of its fingers before being dragged from the room by Foundation guards. In the following debrief, he further berated the mannequin as useless and lousy at its job of being controlled by him. In response, 847 extracted its own brains, eyes, and clavicle before shattering its own hands in dismay. So why does 847 behave this way? While it may appear monstrous, it seems that the reason SCP-847 does what it does is all too human. It hurts women because it itself is hurting, and it's willing to hurt itself even more for the approval of the objects of its desire. As a result, it's an anomaly trapped in an endless cycle of pain and violence. Perhaps one day, it'll be able to free itself from the loop, but that day is unlikely to come for this murderous mannequin anytime soon. It skitters in the dark, its insect-like legs tapping across the marble floors as terrified Foundation researchers flee. They hear its voice, the deep, silky tones of an elderly British man, spouting nonsense like, "The nightmare is a dream to the nameless slug that wanders across minefield in the remains of deer and kings." While the scientists run, the creature gains on them. It's fast, impossibly fast. While they still try to escape down this darkened hallway, ear-splitting containment breach sirens blast through the air. They may try to escape, but it's futile. In a sense, they're already dead. All they are now is prey for the heart of darkness. When someone says the word heart, there are a lot of images that come to mind. You might think of Valentine's Day, heart-shaped cards and candies. You might think of heartbreak, rejection, loss. You might simply think of a heart in the anatomical sense, the vital organ that pumps blood through our bodies. It's unlikely, though, that you would associate the word heart with terror, destruction, and countless deaths. However, employees of the SCP Foundation might think differently, especially if they've ever had a run-in with SCP-058. Much of the information about 058's discovery is highly classified, but the few details that are known paint a chilling picture. At an SCP Foundation test site, the day was proceeding as usual, with scientists and security personnel going about their regular daily tasks. There was no hint of danger in the air, beyond the base level that always comes with setting foot in an SCP Foundation site, at least. Several researchers were performing an experiment, the specifics of which have been expunged from all records, involving the carcass of a cow. When a researcher, Dr. C, placed his hands on the specimen and prepared to dissect it, he was shocked to feel a pulse coming from the supposedly dead animal. Dr. C shared his surprise with his colleagues, but his concerns were dismissed immediately. Clearly this was a corpse. He was imagining things, they said. After all, he was relatively new to the job. It was probably just nerves. The head researcher, Dr. L, insisted that he take over. Pushing Dr. C to the side, Dr. L began to make an incision into the animal's chest. As he did, he too felt something peculiar. There was no doubt about it. This dead cow had a beating heart. He looked up from his work to tell the other researchers to explain what he felt, but by then, it was too late. Something horrible was already happening. With a stomach-churning sound of squishing flesh, the cow's heart burst from its chest and flopped onto the floor. It was terrifyingly large, and all the doctors jumped back from the sight of it. 4 spindly, spider-like legs poked through the flesh of the heart, and it began to quickly skitter about the room. Researchers reviewing the security footage would later note that it didn't just move randomly. It seemed agitated, angry at being discovered, and it displayed immediate hostility towards the scientists in the room. 4 tentacles next unfurled from within the heart and stretched out into full, writhing appendages. They moved frighteningly fast as the heart whipped around the room and were coated in sharp spines. Finally, a stinger poked out from the back of the heart, where the whole of the superior vena cava should be. All of the scientists leapt into action, with one reaching for a scalpel and another moving towards the door. But before the men could so much as call for help, the tentacles wrapped around them and ripped them to shreds. Hearing screams coming from the laboratory, security personnel arrived to contain the threat. However, they were no match for the strange creature that would soon be known as SCP-058. It tore through the security team in minutes, leaving their tattered remains in its wake. Much to the horror of the surviving personnel at the site, SCP-058 was able to escape containment and make its way to a neighboring town. Reports of the incident said that, when the creature reached the town, you could hear the screaming for miles. SCP-058 carved a path of violence through the town, attacking everything in sight with its stinger and tentacles, and leaving a trail of strange fluid from its stinger. Dozens of citizens were killed, and 70% of the buildings were completely destroyed. When agents were dispatched to the location to retrieve the creature, they were shocked to see the level of destruction caused by something so small. The scent of blood and smoke filled the air, and severed limbs littered the ground alongside splintered wood and collapsed brick. The survivors removed from the wreckage were inconsolable, only calming down once they were given an amnestic to erase their memory of the encounter with SCP-058. They had to be given new lives as well, as there was nothing left of their old ones. SCP Foundation agents were only able to capture and contain SCP-058 after it was crushed by pieces of a building that collapsed on top of it. They found it flattened under a slab of stone, legs flailing uselessly, tentacles limp. The agents were able to safely remove the debris and bring in the heart without any more casualties that day. Once it was brought into captivity, the heart was contained for 3 weeks and remained largely quiet during that time. It was almost inconceivable that this small creature hadn't been killed in the incident, but the Foundation would soon learn that this creature was freakishly durable. It escaped once more while being transferred to an SCP containment site, again causing injuries and death. Having only experienced SCP-058 in its docile injured form, the team responsible for the transfer was unprepared for the sheer power and violence the creature was capable of. It was able to escape an armored car and make its way into a forest, where it eviscerated several squirrels and rabbits. Or rather, they were believed to be squirrels and rabbits. The remains were too mutilated to properly identify. It was only finally apprehended after being crushed by an armored tank. But even this didn't kill the creature, and it was transferred to Armed Biocontainment Area 14, where it remains to this day. There is a great deal about SCP-058 that is horrifying, but there is one attribute it has shown in captivity that would make even the most seasoned researcher's skin crawl. Though it has no anatomical capacity for speech, no throat, vocal cords, or even a respiratory system, SCP-058 speaks. Not only does it speak, but it speaks constantly, in the deep voice of an elderly British man. No one knows who the voice might belong to, or if it belongs to anyone at all. Perhaps it belongs only to SCP-058 somehow. As is often the case with SCPs that are capable of speech, there have been multiple attempts to interview the creature, and each time, it ended in complete disaster. The only interview with an available transcript, Interview 05804, was conducted by Dr. Johnston with several personnel in the room for additional security. Dr. Johnston attempted to get at the origins of the creature, asking for its name and where it was from. The creature responded in cryptic, unsettling poetry, giving answers to simple questions with, "I had dreams of the Queen, wonders that lived inside the hearts of love, and silent treatments for all the elderly that I knew were once whole." After the 4th recitation of a similar verse from the heart, Personnel D-067 made a comment on the creepy nature of its responses, almost as if it was offended by the remark. SCP-058 immediately stretched a tentacle across the room, wrapped it around D-067 and lifted him into the air. He began screaming and clawing at the tentacle in an attempt to free himself as his fellow personnel tried to help him. They grabbed at the tentacle, but found their hands pierced and bloodied by the spikes that cover it. Dr. Johnston commanded 058 to let him go, but it did not oblige. Instead, the man was crushed to death by the tentacle, and his limp body left to drop to the floor. The interview concluded with a single statement from the nightmarish heart. The sensual violence of lust is all the assurance you will ever need to know the worth of life. SCP-058 never seems to say anything that has to do with the people or events around it. It speaks in the same haunting, poetic language even when it's attacking or killing something. No matter what happens to it, what is done to it, or what anyone says, SCP-058 keeps talking, and its tone of voice with the pace of speech never changing, and further attempts to interview it have been abandoned due to the safety risk involved. So what happened to the creature often called the Heart of Darkness? Where is it now? SCP-058 is kept in an isolated containment chamber made of reinforced heat-resistant steel with a backing of reinforced concrete. In order to placate its bloodthirsty, carnivorous tendencies, the creature is given a live cow every 3 days. It is uncertain how exactly SCP-058 eats, given that it does not have a mouth or stomach, but every time it is finished with a cow, only bones remain. Routine maintenance is conducted on a tight schedule, and the heart is never allowed out of its containment area under any circumstances. After 2 previous escapes from containment, the Foundation is not taking any chances. Its constant speech is recorded via audio devices that are running at all times. Out of concern for their safety and mental health, no personnel are permitted to listen to recordings of SCP-058 speaking for more than 30 minutes at a time. It is unknown what will happen to someone who listens for longer, but it has been suggested that the consequences could be dire. If the creature ever escapes again, the containment site is ordered to be destroyed via the detonation of an on-site nuclear weapon. Under no circumstances can it be allowed to make its way out into the world again. Even with all these precautions in place, SCP-058 has been responsible for over 150 deaths at its current containment site. There are some at the Foundation who have campaigned for SCP-058 to be terminated, believing that there is more harm than good done by keeping it alive. However, all attempts to terminate it have so far failed. No matter how much physical trauma the heart suffers, it does not seem to be able to be killed. It can only be incapacitated for a short time. There is a classic horror story by Edgar Allan Poe called The Telltale Heart. In it, a man murders an old man and buries his body beneath the floorboards of his home. There, even though the old man is certainly dead, the murderer swears he can hear the beating of the heart coming up through the floorboards. No matter what he does to quiet the sound, he cannot escape it, and is eventually driven mad by the incessant beating of the dead man's heart. SCP-058 may not be a man's heart, a human heart, or even a real heart at all. However, just like the Telltale Heart, it continues to impossibly beat no matter how hard anyone tries to stop it. The steady thump of its pulse haunts the SCP Foundation, a grim reminder that there is something within its walls that can and will kill everyone it can if given the chance. It couldn't be destroyed by collapsed buildings, an armored tank, or an army of experts, and the contingency plan of a nuclear blast is not even guaranteed to work. It is entirely possible that, once the facility has been laid waste and all the staff have been incinerated, and the smoke has finally cleared, the Heart of Darkness will still be there, still beating, still talking, and still killing. SCP Foundation agents stationed at Area 37 had intercepted chatter from a normally closed communication system in a nearby city. To anyone else, the calls that the Foundation were eavesdropping would seem innocent, even boring. But the Foundation immediately recognized the coded language being used. They were listening to communications between underground cells of the Serpent's Hand, a dangerous paramilitary organization that stands in opposition to everything the Foundation is trying to do. Once deciphered, the Serpent's Hand messages revealed plans for killing Foundation personnel, breaking into containment sites, and releasing anomalous creatures and objects into the world. Pretty standard stuff for the Foundation's least favorite anomaly-loving insurgents, but they kept using one code that even the Foundation didn't have any intel on. They kept asking about the condition of the Sisters. Fate has a funny way of sneaking up on you though, and in time,
They would know more about the powerful, sadistic, reality-warping beings known as the Sisters than they could have possibly imagined. But what they would eventually learn was not the kind of data that anyone would ever want to have. After intercepting clear lines of communication from a local Serpent's Hand cell, triangulating the location of their compound was child's play, and mobile task forces were dispatched from Area 37 with orders to neutralize the potential threat before they could mount an attack on a facility. Just when the Serpent's Hands least expected it, they had heavily armed Foundation soldiers kicking down their doors, crashing through windows and rappelling down from the ceiling. As expected, the Serpent's Hand put up a fight, but thanks to their superior training and the element of surprise, the Foundation's mobile task forces came out on top. They were able to capture 15 members of the group for interrogation, as well as a collection of anomalous objects being stored by the group. Among them were a small wooden loom, an enamel needle, and a glass eye. When the task force obtained these seemingly mundane items, a haunted-looking Serpent's Hand began laughing wildly. He kept repeating,
"You have no idea what you're getting yourselves into."
Nobody knew just how right this man was. Not yet, anyway. Congratulating themselves on a job well done, the mobile task forces hauled their captives and the new anomalous items back to Area 37, a heavily isolated Foundation site that specializes in the early containment of anomalous objects for initial observation and study. The objects hadn't displayed any anomalous properties in transit. Maybe the Serpent's Hand was lying, and these weren't dangerous items at all, or it was actually just a pile of junk. Either way, they were sent to a Foundation researcher on site to conduct preliminary tests. The loom, the needle, and the glass eye were laid out across the table for observation, when suddenly, the attending researcher felt a dark presence looming behind him. He turned, with sweat beading on his brow, and saw 3 humanoid translucent figures floating in the air behind him. They would soon become known as SCP-1765, 1, 2, and 3. The researcher could feel the power emanating from these silhouettes. Reality seemed to bend and shimmer around them, the way heat distorts the air into a mirage. He could tell right away that they were powerful reality warpers. Even in their brief time communicating with the researcher, 1, 2, and 3 displayed both intelligence and unique personalities. 1 was clearly the ringleader, displaying an articulate command of language. 2 displayed a more mischievous side, speaking with a Cockney accent, and had a tendency towards creepy giggling. 3 was the least communicative of them all, preferring to speak in short, simple sentences, often consisting of just single words, though of course, actions speak far louder than words, and it didn't take long for the sisters to define themselves with their actions. 1 told the scared and confused researcher that they'd been observing the SCP Foundation for quite some time, and that they deeply admired the Foundation's adherence to the scientific method. Of course, the researcher wasn't so much flattered by the sisters' statement as they were afraid for their life. They tried to call security for backup, but found that their tongue was withering and turning into a shriveled, blackened husk in their mouth. The sisters didn't like to be interrupted. As the tongueless researchers slowly collapsed in front of them, the sisters explained the purpose of their visit. They wished to assist the Foundation in their quest for knowledge, and as such, they would conduct a number of experiments on their behalf. They would then happily share the resulting data with the Foundation to compare notes. 1 expressed optimism, saying that she believed they were about to embark on a beautiful scientific relationship. The reality couldn't be further from the truth. The sisters began their work, moving rapidly around the facility, bending and twisting reality wherever they went. They circled Area 37, making it separate from the rest of the world it inhabited. Area 37 no longer belonged to planet Earth. It belonged to the sisters. It was their private experimentation lab, filled with live and unwilling guinea pigs. The Foundation attempted to retake the facility by force, sending in Mobile Task Force Iota-6, also known as the Canvas Cats, into the belly of the beast, but they never returned. In addition to changing the fabric of reality itself, they also altered the physical structure of Area 37 to better serve their experimental designs. It was divided into 4 sections, marked A, B, C, and D, each with their own unique purpose. Section A, which had formerly been Area 37's storekeeping, mess hall, and dormitories, had been the least affected by the sisters' attacks on reality. The biggest alterations were the appearance of two large metal vats situated in the east corner of the mess hall, a monitoring station connected to the other sections of Area 37 that replaced the storekeeping zones, and an imposing marble sign hanging above the dormitories that reads, "Control Group." A quick refresher from science class. The control group in an experiment is the group that isn't subjected to the experimental effects the others are, so they can be used as a benchmark to measure against. The same was true here. The prisoners in the control group were the safest of all, but they were forced to do something almost as bad. They had to watch the horrors playing across the rest of the facility. One of the sisters would occasionally return to this section to oversee the feeding of the control subjects, and to encourage them to take part in the observation of their unlucky peers. Section B, which had formerly been Area 37's outer grounds and sports facilities, had been transformed into the center of a localized spatial temporal abnormality. In layman's terms, this meant that its size, climate, atmospheric conditions, pressure, and temporal flow were all subject to constant changes based on the whims of Sister Number 1, who oversaw all the experiments performed in Section B. For those unfortunate enough to be trapped in Sector B, SCP-17651 was their god. But she didn't subject them to her whims randomly. No. In her own words, the purpose of Section B was to delve into the effects of repetitive action performed under unusual conditions on the human psyche. For example, one experiment was set up to test the physical and mental fortitude of a researcher, a field agent, and a sanitation worker. The trio were confined in a sports center and ordered to measure the length of every single pipe and the angle at which each connected to others with nothing more than a wrench, a ruler, a brown paper pad, and a ballpoint pen. The task was an arduous one, taking over 10 hours, and as soon as the subjects were done, one restructured the sports center and ordered them to perform the task again. The same happened another 459 times before one finally concluded the experiment, leaving the subjects with broken bodies and minds in the aftermath. Section C, which had previously been the facility's main office block, exhibited a similar level of anomalous activity to Section B, except that it was the domain of the more sadistic and mischievous Sister Number 2. Her main area of scientific interest was studying group dynamics and interpersonal relationships during extreme conditions. Very extreme conditions. For one experiment, the office block had been transformed into a kind of football stadium, with the goalposts removed and replaced by concrete bunkers. The two teams were the captured Serpent Hand members and the members of MTF Iota-6, fresh off their attempt to retake the site. The two groups were forced into a deadly game with incomprehensible rules, including rising platforms and hooded figures throwing fiery projectiles into the crowd, trying to incinerate the players. But victory didn't lead to safety, as the winners of the game were crushed to death with giant metal hammers, just for the fun of it. Two didn't even try to pretend that this act had a valid scientific justification. Section D, which had once been the facility's high-risk containment area, was now the strangest and most mysterious section of all. Under the charge of the equally peculiar and enigmatic Sister Number 3, this area appeared physically unchanged from its state prior to the arrival of the sisters. Temporally, however, Section D was the most warped of them all. It existed in a kind of temporal bubble, outside of the rest of our reality's timeline, giving 3 a frightening amount of control over all that went on in her domain outside of time. There she was performing the most strange and incomprehensible experiment of all. The subject was the former site director at Area 37. He was brought to a table and asked to choose between 2 different flavors of ice cream that were presented to him. Sounds simple enough. So then why is this the worst of all? Because the site director is caught in a time loop. He's been choosing between various flavors of ice cream for over 10,000 hours, and he doesn't even seem to know. 3's only comment on the matter? Delicious. All attempts to liberate the unfortunate inhabitants of Area 37 have failed miserably. The sisters don't appear to operate on any form of logic or empathy, and thus cannot be reasoned with. With talks having failed and Mobile Task Force Iota-6's attempt to retake the site ending in disaster, the only solution left was to create a guarded perimeter around the area. using technology like the Scranton Reality Anchor to fight back against any potential escape by the sisters. The sisters are potentially so dangerous that if they ever truly set their minds to leaving, it's considered acceptable to detonate the facility's on-site nuclear warhead in hopes of finally putting a stop to them. In the meantime, the Foundation has built giant external servers for processing the vast quantities of research data the sisters are constantly sending from their horrifying experiments. Sadly for the inhabitants of Area 37, their grim fate continues to this day. The experiments never stop, and the subjects of said experiments seem to be condemned to the eternal torment of SCP-1765. In a way, their unwilling sacrifice protects us all, because if ever the sisters were interested in performing experiments on a larger sample size, well, all we can do is hope we end up in the control group. At Site-19, many anomalies are kept secure. One, however, does not fit in with the rest. He is a Caucasian man of around 55 years of age, who at first glance seems normal in every way. He's average height, average weight, and dressed in business attire. Calling himself Gustav Noble, he seems to be a perfectly pleasant American man who seems to be deeply out of place compared to the hundreds of other objects and entities kept at the largest SCP containment facility. So why is he so closely guarded? What secrets are kept inside this man's head? To understand why SCP-657 is so important, one has to go back to his recovery. Mr. Noble worked for years as an undertaker at a funeral home in the United States, not raising any attention. But there was a man who worked for him, and they didn't get along. They argued frequently, and one day SCP-652 had to correct the man's work, something that he had to do frequently. They argued, and suddenly Mr. Noble got angry. He yelled out, "What does it matter? You'll be dead before the end of the week." There were multiple people present, and they all thought Mr. Noble must be losing his mind. That is, until it came true. 3 days later, the man was working on his home when he slipped and fell from his roof. He was killed instantly, in what would seem like a tragic accident. There was no evidence pointing to another cause of death, but many people remembered Mr. Noble's outburst at work and reported him to the authorities as a possible killer. That was enough for the police, and they arrested Mr. Noble. They were never able to find any physical evidence linking him to the case, but they questioned him relentlessly. While he never indicated that he was responsible, Mr. Noble did make similar comments about one of the arresting officers also being close to death. That man met his own end 2 days later, when a suspect fatally shot him during an apprehension. The two deaths seemed unrelated, but the police didn't believe it, and neither did the SCP Foundation. The police were convinced that this normal-looking man had somehow been involved in the officer's death, and they made a request for federal assistance as they investigated. While they didn't understand what had happened, they knew they wanted to see the man pay for his crimes. The justice system moved quickly, and Gustav Noble was put on trial for both murders. In near record time, he was convicted of one murder and of conspiracy to commit the other, and he was sentenced to death. According to the officers who apprehended him, he would soon be facing the death chamber and justice would be done. But it was all a lie. The SCP Foundation is quite experienced with extracting prisoners. Condemned prisoners are one of their best sources for the recruiting of D-Class personnel, and they know how to remove a prisoner from incarceration and leave the authorities no clue that anything went awry. They used those procedures to retrieve Mr. Noble before his date with the executioner. But unlike most inmates the Foundation plucks from death row, this one wasn't headed for D-Class duty. The Foundation believed he was much more important than that. They knew that this man, who would soon be classified as SCP-657, had a unique link to death itself. Once secured at Site-19, SCP-657 was debriefed and investigated by Foundation officials, which is when they became aware of the full extent of his abilities. SCP-657 had the ability to predict the time of anyone's death, sometimes with terrifying accuracy. All it takes for him to make a prediction is for him to make physical contact with the person, which can be something as simple as shaking their hand. The prediction is involuntary. As soon as he makes contact,
he gets the information about how much longer they have to live. He was able to predict the deaths of the 2 men he had made contact with down to the day, but when exposed to some D-class personnel who had already been slated for termination the next day, he was able to make predictions down to the minute. But there was one weak spot in SCP-657's predictions. The closer the person he makes contact with is to their moment of death, the more accurate he is. But that works in reverse as well. If he touches someone who is still far away from their time of death, his predictions get fuzzier. He can still predict the general time of death, but if it's a decade or more away, all he can see is the year with no more details. No matter how accurate the time he gives is, he never gets any other information, such as the cause of death. All he gets is a number inside his head. But while the details might be unclear, they are no less accurate, and every prediction SCP-657 has made about the time of death has been proven true. SCP-657's powers seem to work the same on every living person, although there are a few odd exceptions. When tested on a select few SCP agents and doctors, he claimed that his abilities came up empty. He simply couldn't see a time of death for them, and the investigations and testing proved he was telling the truth. This indicates that future investigations about these flukes should center not on SCP-657, but on the individuals who seem to be immune. So far though, no common link or explanation has been found between them other than the fact that they all work for the Foundation. What does stay consistent is the reaction people have to SCP-657. When encountering him, people will nearly always report that they find him strange, unpleasant, or creepy. They may be sensing his abilities, even if they're not aware of them. But when they're informed that he can predict the time of death, the unsettling feeling seems to escalate. When they don't know, they simply can't identify what causes them to have this disturbing feeling. Could this be a milder but similar effect to that caused by SCP-053? A small child who makes otherwise stable people feel compelled to act violently. Right now, the reaction people have to SCP-657 is not considered a source of concern, but the Foundation is keeping an eye on it. SCP-657 is an unusual specimen in other ways too, though, and that requires unusual protocols. SCP-657 is one of the lowest security residents at Site-19, with his living quarters being a large room with a queen-size bed and any reasonable amenities he requests. He's not considered a threat to escape and displays no hostility, so the main concern is keeping him healthy and stable for future testing. His nutritional needs are taken care of, with the staff providing him with daily meals and vitamins, along with medication for his arthritis. His quarters look closer to a hotel room than to a cell, and initially, he was able to move around Site-19 as he wished, as long as he was accompanied by a staff member of proper security. So why did this have to change? Nothing differed in SCP-657's behavior, and no attempts to escape or security breaches were made. However, what did become clear was that SCP-657 freely wandering around the facility was a danger, not to others, but to himself if he encountered the wrong being. This stems from an experiment where SCP-657 was introduced to SCP-076, better known as Abel, and he is one of the most volatile SCPs in Site-19. SCP-076 consists of 2 separate entities, a black cube of engraved stone and the human-like, heavily tattooed male figure that resides inside it. While Abel spends most of his time dormant in a death-like state, he occasionally awakens and seeks out the nearest human being, which he then seeks to kill unless he himself is terminated. When killed, he eventually reincarnates within the cube. SCP-076 is a puzzle to the Foundation, and they thought SCP-657 could help them answer it. SCP-657 was introduced to SCP-076-2, as the humanoid Abel is officially designated, under pretenses of having him join Mobile Task Force Omega-7, an experimental team consisting of some powerful but controllable SCPs. This was really a way to see if SCP-657 could answer any questions about SCP-076-2's lifespan. Given the being's supernatural nature and unique resurrection process, it's not a huge surprise that the answer was no. What was a surprise was how SCP-657 reacted. The process of determining someone's lifespan is usually quick and easy for SCP-657. The numbers will usually appear in his mind in just seconds. But when he touched SCP-076-2, things went very wrong. His eyes immediately rolled back into his head and he collapsed. There was no physical cause for this, but he fell into a coma and didn't wake up for over a week. After he woke up, he was examined for any lingering health issues and interviewed so the Foundation could learn what he experienced. It turned out the answer was that he experienced nothing. He had no memory of the events, or of even meeting SCP-076-2 at all. This indicates that either SCP-657's abilities won't work on anything that's not technically human, or that SCP-076-2 simply doesn't have a lifespan and will continue to reincarnate forever. It was clear that SCP-657 had an Achilles heel. Exposure to human-like but ultimately inhuman SCPs had the potential to mess with his abilities and create serious adverse side effects. While this time he had recovered in only a week, no one knew if the next time would cause lasting damage. It was determined that security measures needed to be increased. SCP-657 would be confined to his quarters, with 2 security staff members stationed outside his door at all times. As SCP-657 had no unusual or dangerous physical abilities, security is still minimal compared to other SCPs, and the Foundation has instructed the site to grant all reasonable requests for entertainment and furnishments to ensure his mental health stays stable. But there is one other thing the Foundation is still trying to avoid. The staff has been ordered to keep their distance from SCP-657 and avoid physical contact unless absolutely necessary. This is because accidental contact, giving SCP-657 access to the death information, could be stressful for both parties. The knowledge of someone's pending death has been shown to weigh heavy on SCP-657, as seen in his initial outburst against his employee, and not everyone wants to know how much time they have left. Minimal physical contact is the best way to preserve SCP-657's use to the SCP Foundation. So what are the long-term plans for SCP-657? There are still many unanswered questions about his ability. While he has now been prohibited from interacting with other non-human SCPs for his own safety, he could still be used by the Foundation to learn vital information about Foundation agents and the danger posed to them on upcoming missions. One question is, can the death date be altered with advanced knowledge? For instance, could an agent who is slated to die in 2 days on a mission be switched off that mission to change their death date? Or would this create a time paradox, potentially upsetting reality by trying to change it? These and many other experiments will likely be tried by the Foundation in the future, once a safe method for testing them is developed and approved. The research continues though, since the best chance the SCP Foundation has at answering the great mysteries of death may just rest in the unassuming older man in Site-19. Imagine this. It's summer vacation and you're a kid. You and your friends are playing in the woods near your neighborhood, just like you've been doing most days during the break from school. One day you spot a treehouse. It's not that high off the ground, and it's very simply built, from leaves, grass, and scraps of wood. You and your friends are curious, so you decide to check it out. Upon investigation, you find a kid in there. He says his name is Billy, and this is his treehouse. You don't recognize him from school, but you figure he just must be new in town. He asks if he can join your group, and wanting to be nice to the new kid, you tell him, okay. You spend the rest of the day playing with him, games like hide and seek, tag, and Red Rover, until it's time for everyone to go home for dinner. Strangely, Billy doesn't seem to leave. He just stays in his treehouse. For the rest of the week, playing with Billy in his treehouse become a regular fixture of your daily routine. But oddly enough, he never comes to hang out at any of your houses, and you never seem to see him anywhere else but in the woods. One day, however, he decides to invite one of your friends, Amy, to hang out with him at the treehouse alone. You think nothing of it, but after that point, you never see Billy again. It's a couple of weeks before you and your friends see Amy again, and when you do, she appears off somehow. She seems to be spending a lot of time in that treehouse. Billy has disappeared, but you and Amy and the rest of the kids keep meeting up to play together in the woods. One day, Amy pulls you aside. She wants you to come meet with her tomorrow at the treehouse, alone. This is typically how an SCP-974 infestation begins, with a mysterious new kid inviting a group of friends to hang out in this crudely made treehouse. But as you might have guessed, this kid isn't a kid. He's SCP-974, a carnivorous monster that only looks like a human child. It can live on small woodland animals, but its preferred prey is kids between the ages of 6 and 12, taking the phrase "you are what you eat" to the next level. The entity will install itself in an area with a sufficient amount of trees, in proximity to a decent population of children. It will then construct a crude treehouse to serve as its nest, and begin befriending groups of between 2 and 5 children. The creature will engage in normal outdoor games and allow its new friends to come and go as they please, building the trust of its newfound playmates. But then, after about a week, it will select its victim. SCP-974 will single out one member of the group and invite them to the treehouse alone. Whether they accept or deny the invitation is irrelevant, because this is the point where SCP-974 will strike, subduing and then devouring that child. After doing so, the creature will disappear from the area, going into a state of hibernation for roughly 12 days. During that time, it goes through a period of metamorphosis, transforming from whoever it looked like before into an exact likeness of the child it just consumed. SCP-974 will continue this cycle of selecting and catching prey until there are no children left in the surrounding area. While it's initially friendly to children, SCP-974 has an intense fear of any older human beings. The mere presence of a person older than 13 is enough to trigger the creature's fight or flight response, and it will run away if it sees any adults coming. When running isn't an option, SCP-974 will resort to violence to defend itself. Despite its looks, SCP-974 is much stronger, faster, and more resistant to damage than a child, and it has been known to completely rip adults apart in situations where it felt threatened and cornered. SCP-974 does not appear to be affected by bullets or striking weapons, and the only reliable way to put down an instance seems to be with fire. When infestations are discovered in the wild, the normal SCP Foundation protocol is to attempt to capture the creature, but if deadly force is required, agents will set fire to the creature's nest and a portion of the surrounding area until it has been confirmed dead, before covering up the destruction as the result of a regular forest fire. The SCP Foundation was able to capture one instance of SCP-974 and place it in containment, hoping that having one in captivity would provide insight into the creature's origins. It was placed in a lightly wooded enclosure at Zoological Reserve Site-16, where it immediately started constructing multiple treehouse nests from the plant life it found. Initially, the containment of SCP-974 involved offering the creature live human prey. Once every 3 months, a group of 4 children would be brought in accordance with Protocol 12. The children would be given room and board in on-site barracks, and encouraged to explore the enclosure and play with SCP-974. If 974 had not selected a victim within 5 days, the group of children would be sent away and a new group would be introduced. This system worked for a few years, but as you might expect, the Ethics Committee had a problem with the practice of offering up live children to a deadly anomaly. Now, as of January 1st, 2015, the team at Zoological Reserve Site-16 are no longer able to evoke Protocol 12 in order to acquire children. Attempts to use another SCP, SCP-1680, a collection of clones of a missing 8-year-old boy, failed, as SCP-974 refused to eat them. The procedures then changed to only allow small animals to be introduced into the enclosure as prey. While it might seem like this was a good idea that would stop SCP-974 from killing any more children, like a lot of seemingly good changes to containment procedures in the Foundation, this well-intentioned move would ultimately have deadly consequences. SCP-974 at first seemed to behave normally despite being denied its favorite food. But then, On August 16, 2015, while on their weekly sweep of the enclosure, patrol teams found that 974 had destroyed all of the tree houses it had built in its time in containment. The SCP itself was also nowhere to be found. There was something new in the enclosure though, a small oval of disturbed soil. A geological team was called in, and through ground-penetrating radar, it was found that there was a humanoid figure buried there, curled up in a fetal position. This couldn't be SCP-974, could it? The figure was much too long and thin to be anything resembling a human child, but it had to be SCP-974. It was the only living thing in the enclosure. The scientists were intrigued, and they theorized that the SCP might have entered a new life stage. Further scans were conducted over the next 10 days. During that time, the creature never moved from its position, though it did continue to grow. It seemed like it was absorbing nutrients from the surrounding soil. The team decided to exhume the creature to examine it. When they dug it up, they found that SCP-974 had stretched out, now measuring 220 centimeters in length and weighing just 37.4 kilograms. It had no features or orifices of any kind anywhere on its body, and its now pale white skin was covered in some kind of sticky mucus that, when examined, was found to contain a previously undiscovered enzyme. The creature was alive, but barely. It wasn't breathing, and its heartbeat was extremely slow, almost to the point of being undetectable. SCP-974 was examined for an additional 4 weeks, after which it died and was sent for dissection. Some of the scientists and researchers at Zoological Site 16 were disappointed to hear about 974's death. As vicious and feral as the creature was, they developed a certain fondness for it and its many tree houses. Luckily, it wouldn't be too much longer until a new specimen was obtained. On October 16, 2016, a group of no less than 7 instances of SCP-974 were discovered near a major American city. The containment team was forced to kill 6 of the anomalies in the attempts to capture them, but 1 instance survived and was taken to Zoological Site 16. As was mandated, the area was burned and Foundation counterintelligence disseminated a cover story about a forest fire caused by an improperly extinguished campfire. The new SCP-974 was, like the original one, placed in the enclosure and denied human prey. Also like the first one, this 974 buried itself after being denied its preferred meals for several months. The decision was made to leave the SCP underground longer than the first instance, to see what it might become if this developmental stage wasn't interrupted. On January 25, 2017, the creature finally dug itself free from the earth. Now designated SCP-974-A, it was far more aggressive than any instance of 974 had ever been before. As soon as it was free from the dirt, it made a beeline straight for the nearest monitoring station. It ripped the roof off and tore the 6 team members stationed there to shreds in just 90 seconds. When the response team arrived 15 minutes later, only 12% of the human remains were able to be recovered. But, strangely enough, it at first seemed like one of the team had been spared. Georgia Stone, one of the monitoring team, was severely injured, but apparently in a stable condition. Disoriented, she approached the response team, begging for assistance and urging them to take her out of the enclosure. But the team was skeptical. They knew that SCP-974 could become an exact copy of any child it consumed, so it followed that the fully grown SCP-974-A might be able to copy adults. They asked Georgia questions in order to confirm her identity, but she was unable to answer them. Having been found out, SCP-974, still mimicking Georgia, attacked the response team. They'd been armed with flamethrowers, but unfortunately, on top of its resistance to damage, the adult form of 974 didn't seem to be afraid of, or harmed by, fire. The team was at a loss for how to kill this thing, or even subdue it long enough to get out safely. SCP-974-A was tearing through the members of the team like they were made out of paper. Thinking quickly, one member of the response team, a guard named Emilio, pulled out one of his standard-issue Foundation hand grenades. When SCP-974-A came at him, he pulled the pin and, holding the grenade, shoved his arm into the creature's open mouth. While the explosion destroyed Emilio's arm, it didn't even break the skin of SCP-974-A. However, it did result in serious damage to its internal organs, which finally killed it. Following its death, an autopsy was conducted, revealing enough about the creature that a new file of effective methods of extermination was able to be created. After this event, the protocols for SCP-974 containment were completely overhauled. Any instances of SCP-974-A seen in the wild are to be killed as quickly as possible. More disturbingly though, the Ethics Committee rescinded their previous decision, and any instances of 974 that are brought into containment are to be provided with human prey again. Letting SCP-974 kill children might not be a very humane way of keeping it contained, but given how much more aggressive and hard to kill this SCP's adult form is, any option that stops the creature's metamorphosis from happening is likely the best option in the long run. So remember, if you're ever out in the woods and see a crudely constructed treehouse, perhaps think twice about how innocent it is. There could be something hungry lurking inside. We've all heard of the Led Zeppelin song Stairway to Heaven, a title that invokes the image of a stairway leading up to a land of peace and paradise. But where else could a stairway lead? To a dusty attic full of old photo albums? To the upper level of a mall where the movie theater and frozen yogurt shop are neatly situated? Perhaps it leads to a rooftop with a beautiful view. Or maybe, just maybe, a staircase could lead you to SCP-2427. SCP-2427, appropriately nicknamed A Thing Full of Stuff, is an extra-dimensional area filled with a variety of unusual and anomalous objects. SCP-2427 can be accessed by way of a broken stone staircase located in rural Ohio. According to local legend, carrying a sprig of hemlock up the broken stairs will allow a person to emerge into a mysterious grass clearing that appears to be in a forest somewhere in the United States. No matter what time a person ascends the staircase, the solar time in the clearing will always be 2 p.m. You know how people say it's 5 o'clock somewhere? Well, it's 2 o'clock somewhere too, and that somewhere is here. The pocket dimension that is SCP-2427 is thought to have been a holding area for weapons, prisoners, and artifacts belonging to an ancient cult known as the Brazen Heart. Little is known about this relatively obscure cult, other than the fact that they worship the demonic entity Moloch, a known enthusiast of violent human sacrifice, and were previously thought to have been eradicated during the Spanish Inquisition. The existence of SCP-2427 suggests that they are very much not eradicated, and are still active. They refer to these holding areas as attics, and though no confirmed members of the Brazen Heart have been contacted, it is considered possible that there are at least a handful of other attics hidden around the world. The Foundation has identified 7 anomalous objects inside of SCP-2427 so far, each strange in its own beautiful, though often terrible way. Like snowflakes, if they were capable of killing or maiming you. The first object in SCP-2427, aka SCP-2427-1, is a seemingly normal fire hydrant. However, if you think there's anything normal about the items found here, then you haven't been paying attention. The hydrant is made out of lead, and when opened, it expels high levels of ionized radiation. No specific measurements of the radiation have been taken yet, but it is definitely hazardous to human health. One unfortunate member of D-Class personnel has proven that it is a high enough level to melt human flesh. Sorry about your face, Dave. The hydrant is currently contained within an electrified perimeter and is not to be opened under any circumstances to prevent any further flesh melting. The last thing we need is another Dave incident. The second object contained within SCP-2427 or SCP-2427-2 is not actually an object at all. It's a building. Only on number 2 and we're already throwing curveballs at you. Trust no one. Surprises lurk around every corner. This particular building resembles a large multi-storied sanitarium built in the 1860s. Though it is clear from the outside that the building has or should have multiple stories, the inside is a different matter. Past the building's front doors is a non-Euclidean space consisting of a single floor and 3 sparsely decorated rooms with one central foyer. The first room is the holding place for SCP-2427-3. The second contains SCP-2427-4, and the third room contains nothing except scattered religious documents, bottled water, and a selection of canned food. No unauthorized staff are permitted to enter the building in order to minimize complications or potential employee casualties. The first two anomalies on this list are hardly even strange by SCP Foundation's standards. Sure, the hydrant can melt your face and the building defies the laws of physics and space, but that's just a regular Tuesday around these parts. Been there, seen that. What else you got? Well, SCP-2427-3 is where things really get strange. If you're wandering through the bowels of SCP-2427-2 and you make a wrong turn into the first room, you will find yourself face to face with a startling sight. This entity is a combination of electronic circuitry, a cow's digestive tract, the hairless head of a human man, a hat rack, several lengths of garden hose, and an unidentified crystalline structure. This creature is extraordinarily fast and strong, exhibiting carnivorous tendencies and a very strong point of view on the world around it. Lucky for us, it is capable of speech and is able to tell us just what it thinks. Though this monstrosity doesn't have much of a right to pass judgment on anyone, cow intestine, body and all, it has expressed a violent hatred of all life that it considers impure. Anyone who encounters SCP-2427-3 experiences an overwhelming desire to submit themselves for judgment, allowing the creature to determine their purity. There is a rumor that if one is judged to be pure, they will have a wish granted. If they are deemed impure, however, they will be devoured alive. If you're tempted to introduce yourself to the creature, your odds are not especially great. The creature has not encountered a single pure being yet. In order to protect the Foundation staff working in its vicinity, the entrance to SCP-2427-3's room has been sealed off with a reinforced steel door, and the windows have been paved over with concrete. Armed guards are watching the entrance at all times. The creature must be fed one live goat per day in order to keep its appetite satiated. The Foundation's goat budget is through the roof these days, but it's worth it to keep the thing contained. Better to spend money on goats now and not spend money on cannibalized personnel later. SCP-2427-4 consists not of an object located within a room, but the room itself. The room, which contains no furniture and a linoleum floor, has a peculiar effect on the human psyche. Once a person steps foot into the room, they lose consciousness for 5 minutes. During this time, they will speak freely, listing off a variety of negative qualities about themselves. Once they wake up, they have no memory of entering this state or anything that they said during it. It's cheaper than therapy, right? But it's also much weirder and less effective, so you get what you pay for in the end. A member of D-Class personnel who was observed inside of the room waxed poetic about his personal failings, beginning his monologue with, "My soul is a den of spiders," and ending it with, "Oh, here whence I awaken, hesitate not to feed my flesh and my soul to the judge beast." Somebody give this guy a hug, because the room seems to have no adverse effects on human test subjects except for causing everyone who hears their monologue a bit of discomfort. There are no containment procedures in effect for it at this time. We've had rooms, fire hydrants, and horrible meat-robot hybrids, and now you can't even trust the clouds in the sky. SCP-2427-5 is a seemingly innocent cloud, hovering stationary over the building. When looked at by a human for more than 3 seconds, the cloud will eject a ball of solid lead towards the person at a supersonic speed. That's right, folks. This cloud can and will shoot you. It hates being observed, but it also hates when you try to leave the perimeter. It will attack any person attempting to leave by firing the same lead ball at them. So far, 14 personnel have been killed by this highly aggressive cloud. And some people still think thunderstorms and hail are the worst things clouds have to offer. So naive. As it is a literal cloud, there is no way to contain it, so no people in the vicinity of the cloud are permitted to look at it for more than 3 seconds at a time. SCP-2427-6 is a series of 18 small trees, spread throughout the instance of SCP-2427. Above ground, the trees look normal, though their species has proven surprisingly difficult to determine. From an external perspective, they are simply ordinary trees. However, radar analysis revealed that the roots of these trees are deeply strange. Instead of the usual twisting tree roots, the ground below these trees contains a mass in the shape of a human body. Much to the disgust of the observing researchers, these humanoid masses occasionally twitch and move, as if alive. The trees themselves appear to be growing from the crotch area of each humanoid figure. How's that for Morningwood? I know, I get it, bad joke. This arrangement between tree and person seems to be some kind of punishment, as each tree is marked with a plaque reading, "The lecherous suffer what they must, and it is beautiful." Until it can be certain that the condition of these human roots is not contagious, these trees are to be treated as potential biohazards and isolated in individual containers. The final object in SCP-2427 currently categorized by the Foundation is SCP-2427-7. SCP-2427-7 is a pile of ashes and wood located just behind a posted sign that reads, "The Liar's Cradle." Extensive testing has been established that the Liar's Cradle was almost certainly used as a torture device in interrogations performed by the Brazen Heart. A person standing within the boundaries of the cradle, which encompasses the aforementioned circle of wood and ashes, is unable to lie without suffering the consequences. Namely, they will be set on fire. The nature of how exactly the Liar's Cradle works is not certain, and more research needs to be done on it. However, this much is known for sure. It contains no sentient intelligence. It is not aware of what it is doing. It does not kill its victims, rather it keeps them miraculously alive as it sets them on fire, prolonging their agony and allowing their interrogators to get the truth out of them. A series of experiments reveal that it only immolates a person who is knowingly lying. D-Class personnel give demonstrably false information to repeat in the cradle without knowledge of its falsehood were not set on fire. However, when those same D-Class personnel knowingly lied in the boundaries, they immediately were set ablaze. It is almost certain that the Brazen Heart cult used the cradle as a method of interrogating presumed liars in their midst. Further investigation will likely reveal human remains beneath the cradle itself, though this is just a hypothesis currently. But come on, there has to be some bones somewhere beneath something as ominous as the Liar's Cradle. Though they have only identified 7 anomalies inside SCP-2427 at the moment, there are plenty more lurking in there, waiting to be discovered. In the foyer of SCP-2427-2, the Foundation discovered an extremely ominous list of items, clearly belonging to members of the cult of the Brazen Heart. This list included some familiar items, such as pilgrim provisions, also known as the canned beans and soup found in SCP-2427-2, a Level 3 Purity Proctor, a purge engine disguised as a fire hydrant, and the Liar's Cradle. However, it also contained many things that have not yet been discovered, such as 1 slaughtering perseverance, 27 pyre children, 3 ascended cultivars, 7 supreme angelics, 9 dragons, and the Brazen Heart itself. Dr. Gordon McElroy, Site Director of Area 2427, put out a memo to all Level 4 and higher staff assigned to the area after the discovery of this list. Understandably, he was most concerned about the supreme angelics and the dragons, particularly the latter. The cult, as most cults are, is fond of deliberately obscure language, but you don't want to rule out the possibility they've got a fire-breathing lizard or 2 stashed away. In the meantime, as the Foundation is working to better understand the contents of SCP-2427, the area has been sealed off to the public. A 500-meter perimeter has been established around its entrance, and a fake private country club has been set up as a front. It's only a matter of time before the rest of the anomalies on the list are discovered, and this thing full of stuff gets even fuller of even more stuff. Let's just hope none of it ever gets out, because if there are more of these addicts out there, who knows what else the Brazen Heart is hiding? Their little cult may not be as extinct as we thought. SCP-1504 is an otherwise normal man who seems to be invulnerable to all forms of harm and is held in a standard human containment cell. He knows his name is Joe, but does not seem to be able to recall his last name, which has led to him being given the nickname Joe Schmo. He was brought to a nearby SCP containment site without incident to be interviewed and studied. At first glance, it seems like it is one of the least interesting entities in SCP containment. But this seemingly uninteresting man turned out to be a far more complicated case than anyone at the Foundation expected. Dr. Lloyd was not anticipating a difficult interview when he stepped into the containment cell to speak with SCP-1504. The mystery man was cooperative, answering questions, although there were some abnormalities. Not only did this man not know his own last name, but he didn't know when he was born. As the interview went on, Dr. Lloyd suffered a spontaneous nosebleed and had to briefly leave the room. Dr. Lloyd returned, and the interview went smoothly, until he asked 1504 about the origin of his invulnerability. The subject began crying and refused to talk about it, and was released to his room. That's where the trouble began. Dr. Lloyd normally ran a rather calm site, with high-tech security systems that were effective at containing the entities inside. As long as the technology worked, the staff was in no danger, and it was designed to be foolproof. Or so they thought. The technical hiccups began slowly. Doors would open when they weren't supposed to, but the resulting breaches were quickly contained. These new issues were worrying, but as long as they stayed manageable, the staff could keep everything under control. But of course, things didn't stay manageable. The site had one dangerous Keter entity on hand that breached containment. When it broke out, the staff who specialized in recontaining anomalies were alerted, but only about half responded. The other missing half were all dead. The remaining staff barely survived and managed to contain the Keter, but their troubles were only beginning. Requests for more staff went ignored, supply drops didn't arrive, and the staff was quickly beginning to run out of the basics. The deaths on site weren't acknowledged by the Foundation, or even many of the people on site. It was as if they had never happened. Things were going from bad to worse, and the true horrors lay ahead. One day, all the doors at the site suddenly opened at once, and the staff was quickly overwhelmed by the freed and enraged entities. Most died, and the surviving ones scattered, seemingly unconcerned with finding any other survivors. The only one who seemed aware of what was happening was Daryl Lloyd, and he knew there was no way to contain this breach. His time was running out, and there was only one thing left to do. He wrote everything that had happened down in a document and sealed it in an indestructible vault. The document opened with a chilling sentence. We didn't know his true anomaly. We didn't know what he could really do. Then Dr. Lloyd activated the failsafe that every SCP site has, an on-site nuke that can be triggered in the event of a breach that would endanger the outside world. The badly injured Dr. Lloyd perished in the blast, along with every surviving staff member and many of the escaped entities at the site. When Foundation staff dug through the rubble, they found the document, although it was badly damaged and parts were unreadable due to bloodstains having been smeared across it. Most of the anomalies kept at the site were accounted for, but one entity was neither confirmed killed or recaptured. So where was Joe Schmo? Not only was SCP-1504 not found on site, there was very little record of him found on any electronic systems or archives. The only evidence found of this mysterious man was the handwritten document left behind by the late Dr. Lloyd, as well as the initial interview that seemed to show absolutely nothing of note. But Dr. Lloyd's last words worried the staff, and a missing entity is never to be taken lightly. It was decided to run the interview footage through multiple filters to rule out any perception-based interference. What they discovered turned out to be one of the biggest threats in the SCP Foundation's history. The interview started similarly, with Dr. Lloyd asking SCP-1504 what his name was, but things soon took a turn from the original log. SCP-1504 was belligerent from the start. He snapped, "I'm not gonna tell you, you'll just ignore me." His response was similar when asked when he was born. He even claimed that Dr. Lloyd wouldn't notice if he punched him in the nose. Dr. Lloyd seemed undisturbed, acting as if he had just been told a year instead of being threatened. Then SCP-1504 decided to test his theory. The mysterious Joe Schmo leapt up from his seat and punched Dr. Lloyd. The doctor's nose began bleeding badly, but he seemed to hardly notice, only commenting that he had a nosebleed and leaving to take care of it. This made SCP-1504 even more agitated, cursing at Dr. Lloyd and desperately seeking to get his attention. As Dr. Lloyd asked why he couldn't seem to be hurt, SCP-1504 lost his head. He began an extended rant where he stated that he could do anything to anyone, even kill the people they love and they wouldn't notice. He claimed to be able to shoot himself with a guard's gun, and nothing would happen. SCP-1504 was in tears, but no one seemed to notice. Dr. Lloyd just kept writing notes as SCP-1504 ranted that he always felt like he was stuck in a room crowded with people, and every single one of them ignored him. He expressed that he wished to die, but was apparently unable due to the nature of his anomaly. Dr. Lloyd didn't seem to hear any of this, and instead thanked SCP-1504 for cooperating with the interview and returned him to his cell. His perception of the interview was exactly what the initial interview had been, completely uneventful. It was clear that SCP-1504 was much more powerful than anyone knew, and now he was missing. The Foundation met and quickly updated SCP-1504's classification from safe to Keter. The classification and description were pieced together slowly due to the subject's cognitohazard abilities, which means that any information known about him may be subjective at any time. A place for him was prepared at Area 114, the Foundation's primary location for containing perception and sensory-based threats. But SCP-1504 is not currently contained, and his unique abilities mean he may never be. After all, how do you contain something when no one knows who or where it is? But the Foundation is prepared. There's a cell waiting for SCP-1504 at the site. A simple-looking 3 by 3 by 3 chamber, but the security on hand is anything but simple. It will be kept closely guarded, with a minimum of 4 Level 3 staff members required for access. 2 staff members will stay inside the control room ready to trigger security measures and even the failsafe if a containment breach happens. The staff is ready to flood the cell with halothane gas if needed, one of the only things that can incapacitate SCP-1504, along with a sharp blow to the head. He cannot be allowed to escape and must be confined and restrained at all times. Any attempt to open the locks must be released by multiple staff members at the same time, and only one can enter the chamber to interact with SCP-1504. So what do we know about what makes SCP-1504 so dangerous? Well, that depends on who you ask, because most people would say there's absolutely nothing dangerous or unique about him. He's just an average Joe, and that's exactly what makes him so dangerous. SCP-1504 is a living cognitohazard that affects the perceptions of everyone around him. No matter what he does, it will be perceived as normal, calm, and forgettable. And the odds are, anyone around him will forget his existence only seconds after they meet him. But that's not his most dangerous ability. In addition to his cognitohazard and his seemingly complete inability to be harmed beyond brief incapacitation, SCP-1504 has the ability to interfere with electronic systems, which caused the catastrophic breach at his original site. Any automated systems around him will start to glitch, and as such his private cell at Area 114 is locked only with simple locks featuring combinations and keys. Testing on the range of his powers is ongoing, and the site will take care to make sure a total containment failure is never allowed to happen again. While the Foundation intends to minimize direct contact with him once captured, any personnel at Area 114 will already be trained in how to resist perception shifts. For any of this to work though, the Foundation has to capture him first, and therein lies the problem. The Foundation was able to capture SCP-1504 the first time simply by reports of his inability to be harmed. That seemed to be the one thing about him anyone can notice. Otherwise, no action he takes, even physically attacking someone, will be memorable in any way, allowing him to slip away undetected. While physically he is little threat to anyone, there is reason to consider him a critical danger to public safety. His ability to disrupt electronic systems means he could be a security risk to any public facility, including banks, prisons, or even nuclear power plants. And there is a reason to believe he may be growing more unstable. No one knows how old SCP-1504 is or if he has a normal lifespan. His inability to be harmed indicates he could be anomalous in other ways, and even if he ages normally, it is clear the isolation of his abilities are making him increasingly angry. He seems to be getting more and more desperate to be noticed by any means necessary. Hence his assault on the unfortunate Dr. Lloyd, and now he's out there in the world, undetected by anyone. Who knows how he'll try to make himself famous or infamous next. The Foundation has made the capture of SCP-1504 one of their highest priorities, and once they get him, they intend to make sure he's never free again. Now they just have to find him. And that's where many Foundation experts are stumped. How do you find something that is designed to go unnoticed? Until they have their answer, their trackers are on the search for reports of a normal-looking Caucasian man, just under 6 feet tall, with a small birthmark on his right shoulder. That should narrow it down. Cast your mind back to the height of the Cold War. The ever-accelerating nuclear arms race brought us closer than ever before to making the nightmare of nuclear Armageddon a terrifying reality. The two main parties in this conflict are the United States and Soviet Union, each amassing huge amounts of nuclear warheads and jumping on any available advantage they can over their enemies. What you may not know is that in order to detect an impending attack from the United States, the Soviets developed what would become known to the West as the Dead Hand. But this experimental piece of technology also had another name, SCP-1984. It is no secret that the Soviet Union feared the threat of US nuclear strikes and invasion just as much as the US feared an attack from them. So SCP-1984 was created to act as a deterrence mechanism, specifically against secure second strikes. Secure second strikes were both a deterrent and overwhelming concern during the Cold War, referring to a country's ability after suffering an initial nuclear attack to still retaliate, firing on their enemy and causing untold damage with their own arsenal of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union knew that any action they made that could be perceived as an attack on United States soil would be threatened with nuclear retaliation, and that if they fired first, America would return fire and potentially annihilate them with a second strike. SCP-1984 was to be an automated system that would activate in response to the destruction of the Soviets' main command and control structure. Given that the Dead Hand was created during the 80s, you might be forgiven for expecting a nuclear detection system built at this point in history to consist of various sensors connected to a computer network. But you have also probably already realized that if this was the case, then the Foundation wouldn't be so interested in it. In actuality, SCP-1984 is a fully autonomous entity rather than a network of sensors for detecting incoming nuclear strikes, or a computer capable of initiating a second strike. Perhaps what makes the Foundation more interested in the Dead Hand is that it is both self-aware and linked simultaneously to every single one of Russia's nuclear launch sites. Not only this, but SCP-1984 also has direct access to every single one of the atomic weapons stockpiled by the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and is capable of launching intercontinental ballistic missiles at a moment's notice. In short, SCP-1984 could very easily and horrifyingly quickly trigger an all-out nuclear war, resulting in the extinction of all life on Earth. No wonder the Foundation considers the Dead Hand such a massive threat. SCP-1984 itself actually consists of the preserved remains of a Russian soldier by the name of Sergeant Marat Chernikov, who was killed during the Soviet-Afghan War in 1982. Most of the official documentation of Chernikov's existence has been expunged by the Russian Federation, and he is only referred to in fragmented documents recovered by the Foundation that refer to a Project December. These remains serve as the location of a semi-sentient consciousness that has been classified as SCP-1984-01. When it remains dormant and is not interfered with, SCP-1984-01 has the ability to receive and process any signal broadcast to it, and is able to decipher information combined in any signal it picks up. However, when global military tensions start to climb, especially when those tensions affect the Russian Federation, or what were once the satellite states of the former Soviet Union, the entity begins to manifest itself in the physical world, and usually in various strange and different ways. SCP-1984-01 has been known to appear in the real world in forms such as a humanoid outline, or a bright red specter taking the shape of a child with its legs cut off. Regardless of which shape it appears in, it is when the Dead Hand manifests in a more physical form that the wider scope of its abilities become clear. As mentioned previously, it can influence and even launch nuclear weapons, overriding their command systems and bypassing launch sequences. After appearing fully, SCP-1984-01 will travel at speeds of up to 140 kilometers an hour, directly to the nearest military installation capable of launching intercontinental ballistic missiles. Once it reaches its destination, SCP-1984-01 will immediately attempt to override the necessary systems to initiate a launch. After firing missiles at their predetermined targets, SCP-1984-01 will hastily travel to another facility housing nuclear ordnance, repeating the process until it has successfully launched all of Russia's atomic weapons. When engaged, the physical manifestation of SCP-1984 is highly aggressive, and will lethally defend itself against anyone that it observes trying to interfere with it or stop it from causing a nuclear launch. The entity has displayed the ability to disrupt the nervous system, causing excruciating pain and debilitating damage to human beings. Its only known weakness, if any, is a susceptibility to microwave radiation. Although exposure to this does not seem to cause any lasting damage to SCP-1984, instead only temporarily disorienting its physical form. As for the origins of SCP-1984, the Soviet Union's official liaison with the SCP Foundation offered some clarity on this. Ironically, during early 1984, the liaison, a doctor named Sergei, described information regarding the Dead Hand as being of grave importance to the continued survival of the human race. Seeing as he was referring to an enemy that could single-handedly launch the Soviet Union's entire nuclear arsenal, he certainly had a point. A top-secret conference was held in Sarajevo between the Foundation's O5 Council and officials from both the USSR and the United States, using the 1984 Winter Olympics as cover, avoiding too many questions about several nations' high-ranking state officials being in the same place at once. The O5 Council was then given full, in-depth information about the Dead Hand, something they had previously assumed was a more conventional form of nuclear deterrence. SCP-1984 was far more, and worse, far out of the control of the Russian government. It was revealed that the entity had been designated outside the original specifications given to those who developed it. Initially, the Soviets had intended for the Dead Hand to be solely used as a secure second strike response. If the leaders of the Soviet Union were killed, SCP-1984 would react in kind to Russia's enemies, launching back all of the USSR's nuclear missiles in retaliation. This is more likely where the Dead Hand nickname comes from, hearkening to the idea of a dead man's switch. Picture that you had been mortally wounded by your worst enemy, shot in the stomach and laying on the ground, rapidly bleeding out. You know that there is no chance you will survive, but you cannot afford to let your enemy get away. What they don't know is that you rigged the entire building around you both with explosives. With your dying breath, you activate the detonator, assuring your own and your enemy's mutual destruction. Kaboom. Then curtains for both of you. The pressing issue, and the reason this secret summit between the USSR, USA, and SCP Foundation was held, was that SCP-1984 was no longer interested in just waiting for Russia to be attacked and only reacting after the fact. Instead, the entity's physical form was trying to preemptively strike at the enemies of the motherland, attempting to activate nuclear launches and send atomic weapons to destroy the United States, France, West Germany, and the People's Republic of China. In other words, the Dead Hand was eager to get a head start at causing total nuclear annihilation, not to mention potentially killing millions and reducing target countries to little more than irradiated craters, awash with deadly nuclear fallout. Both the Soviet Union and the United States begged the SCP Foundation to intervene and contain SCP-1984, and under the direction of the O5 Council, they stepped in to take direct control of the situation, establishing new containment procedures in the hopes of keeping SCP-1984 from hitting as many launch buttons as it could find. The embalmed remains that seemed to create the manifestations of the Dead Hand entity were held securely in an armed containment complex near Verkhoyansk, part of the Sakha Republic within the Russian Federation. SCP-1984 was placed within a standard humanoid containment cell, which was itself held within a Faraday cage, a type of enclosure constructed with or covered in conductive material designed to block electromagnetic fields. This was done to block any external broadcast signals from reaching SCP-1984, and thus causing it to manifest its other form if it learned of an impending attack on Russia, even a fictional one, perhaps as a part of a television broadcast. As part of the Dead Hand's containment, all signals broadcast near its cage are to be monitored, and only broadcasts featuring doctored information would reach the entity. Thankfully to the work of the SCP Foundation's Information Control Team, SCP-1984 is drip-fed a stream of carefully fabricated information. Using on-site equipment and facilities, a team of military historians, economists, actors, and Soviet media specialists, the Information Control Team have created an ongoing narrative wherein the Cold War never ended. Through falsified radio and television broadcasts made to look like era-appropriated news organizations, they managed to keep SCP-1984 convinced that the nuclear stalemate between the Soviet Union and United States is still ongoing. Unfortunately, sometimes information from the real world is able to bleed through. An incident involving SCP-1984 occurred on August 8, 1984, and almost brought forth a full-scale nuclear war. While preparing for a campaign speech, the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, uttered the following joke.
I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
Naturally, thousands of media outlets reported on this, but signals of those broadcasts, including recordings of the president's remark, made their way to SCP-1984. Foundation researchers were both unsure of how these transmissions breached the Faraday cage surrounding the Dead Hand, and were unable to prevent what happened next. Hearing what it could only assume was a genuine declaration of war, the manifestation of the SCP-1984-01 entity happened immediately after Reagan's words reached its containment cell. This time, the entity appeared as a semi-transparent woman, withered and blue, wearing traditional Pashtun dress. Armed personnel guarding SCP-1984's cage engaged the entity, causing it to retaliate, lashing out and attacking any that stood in its way. One captain and 2 privates that suffered the brunt of SCP-1984's offensive capabilities began bleeding heavily from their ears, seizing violently. Most gruesomely of all, a liquid leaked from their eyes and nose believed to have been cerebrospinal fluid. While armed personnel attempted to use microwave-emitting weaponry to slow the entity down, the Information Control Team was frantically trying to record a new falsified broadcast, in the hopes that SCP-1984 would cease its hostilities and the entity would dissipate before it was able to travel at high speed to any nearby Soviet nuclear facilities and begin bombarding the United States. Their first attempt to record a new broadcast that would result in a cessation of SCP-1984's slaughter of its guards was interrupted when a nearby wall collapsed. Desperate to recontain the creature, the Information Control Team tried to film the broadcast a second time and succeeded, although one of the actors portraying a newsreader suffered a stroke and had to be edited out to convince the Dead Hand of its supposed authenticity. What followed was a short news clip clarifying that Russia's Politburo was in on President Reagan's joke, including old footage of the USSR's General Secretary Konstantin Chernenko, confirming that the Soviet Union's nuclear forces were not on high alert. Miraculously, after 15 more minutes of sustained fighting with guards, SCP-1984's physical manifestation began to disappear, gradually dematerializing while it seemed to attack with far less intensity. Eventually, containment was reestablished, at the cost of the deaths of 17 members of Foundation staff, both guards and researchers. A further 8, however, suffered traumatic brain injuries that left them all permanently disabled. The one upside is that this incident remains the only time SCP-1984 has ever breached its containment and caused harm to others. And considering that it could very well have launched Russia's nuclear arsenal, the casualties could easily have been much higher. So remember, folks, don't joke about nuclear weapons, especially if you're the president. You never know what anomalies lurking in the bodies of dead Russian soldiers might be listening, and if they are, you'd better hope they have a sense of humor. Now check out SCP-001 The Scarlet King and SCP-2935 O Death for more anomalies that could destroy the world.